welcome to another session of the Retro RPG Roundtable. My name is Adam Hawes. I'm the creator and developer of Realms of Antiquity for the TI-99 4A home computer. We have with us today Mark.
I'm Mark Lemmert, the lead developer of Nox Archaeast, an Apple II RPG sword and sorcery themed that was released in December of 2020.
All right, Stefan.
Yeah, my name's Stefan. I'm the founder of a small indie game studio called 81 Monkeys, and we're working on an open world pixel art RPG called World of Antera.
Very nice. Other Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam Burr, otherwise known as Golden Flame. I am working on Chronicles of Eleusis, The Dark Unknown, which will hopefully maybe be done soon. It's yet another Ultima-inspired retro RPG.
All right, and we have a special guest today, Matt Barton.
Thank you. I'm Matt Barton. I'm probably much better known for my books and YouTube channel than my gaming development, but I am kicking around a little thing called Rat Slayer Chronicles.
Very nice. Okay, so today the topic of discussion is story, which is a pretty crucial part of any CRPG. So what we'll do is I have a die, and there are 5 of us, and I will present the question, roll the die, and then the person that gets picked answers the question, and then they pick the next person to answer the question. That way we have things shaken up a little. So our first question, which I have over on my other monitor here, what non-video games were inspiration for your game story? Like basically content like books, TV shows, movies. And away we go. And it is a 1. So that would be Mark.
Well, this is a great question because I think this kind of content is hugely formative for probably most, if not all, game developers. And for me, I think I'm going to just go in chronological order of the influences. The very first would have been Lord of the Rings. I first saw a animated cartoon of the Hobbit, early 1980s. So I was pretty young, but old enough to remember. It was the made by Rankin Bass. I think that's actually 2 names of 2 different people. But that was really the earliest influence that I can remember, and then that was followed on by the same producers made an animated version of Return of the King a number of years later, and that was just blew my mind in seeing that portrayal. And then wasn't too many years later I actually read the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books, and got totally immersed in that, and that ultimately led to more sword and sorcery reading, like Dragonlance, another big influence, and then also Forgotten Realms, particularly Bob Salvatore's books, the Icewind Dale trilogy, and then all of the kind of I think he's published probably 36 books in that world, all revolving around the character Drizzt, or most of them.
It is in the 30s, yeah.
In the 30s, yeah. I can't, on one hand, how much I liked it, I can't believe I haven't read them all, except he keeps making them, so I can't keep up. And then I feel like when I pick up, it's like I got to go back, 7 books before, just so I remember what the context was. And not that I'm complaining. Thank you, Bob. One day.
Important question about the Lord of the Rings cartoon. Do you still get where there's a whip, there's a way stuck in your head at completely random moments like I do?
Oh, yes, that song, as well as You're Standing in the Eye of the Storm. Just all the whole soundtrack is forever in my head. For sure. Yeah, so I would say those, for me, those are the biggest influences. And I think I saw the animated Hobbit and Return of the King possibly before I played my first actual RPG game on the computer, or if it wasn't before, it was right around the same time. And then as the later reading started to get mixed in, I was already playing RPGs at that point, so it really all just kind of started to intertwine together. And I actually remember there was a point in Dragonlance, Dragons of the Autumn Twilight, the first book, where Tanis made some comment to Flint in reference to their quote unquote dungeon crawling days. And I thought that was pretty cool because it's like, well, dungeon crawling, that's what we do, in Ultima 3 and, stuff. And here they're talking about doing in the book. And at the time, I didn't quite understand the D&D influence that was behind Dragonlance and how well, so okay, of course that would be kind of like a connection there to the tabletop settings, but that was pretty cool just in my own mind as far as how I was integrating the worlds together. And then very lastly, I just wanted to throw a call out to a very lesser known fantasy setting, a series of books called the Time Master trilogy by Louise Cooper that are, if not the best, definitely some of the best fantasy that I've ever read. It's also a sword and sorcery type setting. And that was a huge influence as well.
Very nice. Yeah, I think my girlfriend reads Louise Cooper. She really likes
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. It's not a very known series at all. So that's really interesting to hear, to meet anybody that even knows somebody who has read it. That's probably the first time that's ever happened for me. That's pretty cool. I wish they were on Kindle, but they're such a backwater that they're not even in print anymore. Of course, I own them all, fortunately, but I wish they were on Kindle. But that's what I got. So how does this work? Adam, you said
You pick someone at random.
Okay. Stefan, over to you.
All right. Yeah, I love this topic. I apologize if my lights turn off. This office has a sensor to detect when people are in the room, and my desk is like the furthest away, so every once in a while it just shuts off on me. But
For the haunted podcast, it's
yeah, it happens. It's the worst because I'm on a early morning like business call or something, and all of a sudden I get all dark. Yeah, so I agree with, I share this similar sentiment that you shared about some of the the franchises that you mentioned there. Dragonlance was a big one for me, and I actually have it tattooed on my arm here. And that book really, any book you read is going to be really about relationships. And but I find that inspiration from Dragonlance in terms of my writing for World of Antera and how I want characters to kind of relate to each other and the roles that I want them to play, as much as I'm able to, because also it's just such a different medium and way less text, obviously. Harry Potter movies, actually. So this is an interesting one. I didn't read the books, but something that strikes me about Harry Potter that I find inspirational for my game development is there's like J.K. Rowling's really great at bringing wonder into her world, and there every like corner you turn around, you find something wonderful, something that is like a twist on something unexpected. And so creating world and environments and locations and things that players are going to explore, I'm constantly asking this question of how do I bring wonder to this corner of the game, and what's a twist that we can add here. It might just be like a creature, or it might be a decoration in a structure, or it could be things like that. So I actually think of that because I think it's one of those things that Harry Potter did really well. And then some anime, Avatar: Last Airbender. I definitely there's a lot of things that I like about the world building in there, and how they're able to walk this line of dealing with really mature themes, but doing it in such a casual, kind of goofy way. I really like that too. I think there's a lot that video games can learn from that. And then science. Science is I'm really big on science. I'm like I probably spend too much time every day reading science, articles or journals. I just find it so wonderful, so fascinating. And it really is like woven into the lore of our world, even though we're high fantasy. you know, like our magic system and a few other things, I'm pulling from, you know, some scientific theories, and it helps me sort of ground certain things within the game, and I think make them relatable, at least to me. And the last thing is just my own life and my experience. Our World of Antera is Ultima's inspired project, and Ultima, I don't like, this is probably a personal trait of mine. I can never be a bad guy in video games. I have a really hard time doing that. I always am the good guy. And I feel like part of that's because of Ultima. You know, you were thrust into this role where you had to be that character. And I really enjoyed that. I really latched onto that. And that carries me through. And I just think about it from time to time, but it carries me through many sort of many moments in my life. So in World of Antera, I really wanted to bring some of that into the game, some of these themes of empowerment, I guess, but not in a heavy-handed way. In fact, not as heavy-handed as even as Ultima did it, but a little more subtle. So, and then I kind of like asked myself, like, what are some, you know, things about my life that I've learned that allow me to do what I do now, that maybe I wouldn't be able to had I not learned those things, and sort of turn those into some tenets within the game world and the lore. So I often look back at people in my life who inspire me, and I find, you know, inspiration in my writing through those individuals. So yeah. Who's next? Adam, do you want to go?
Which one?
Other Adam.
Which one?
Sorry.
Two dice rolls there.
Sure.
I had an advantage.
This was an interesting question because it made me realize that, yeah, I've mostly stolen from other games. But there are definitely some things in a kind of general way, like nearly all fantasy. Of course, there is some Tolkien influence. I'm one of those fools who's read the Silmarillion more than once. So there's definitely, it's kind of inescapable. There are some hints of the series Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which is a really good high fantasy trilogy. There's some Star Wars, some Princess Bride, both book and movie. One thing that contributed something that I can like definitely point to, like this thing in the backstory I basically ripped off from something else, is the last book of the original Rift War Saga trilogy by Raymond Feist. There are elements in my backstory that are basically just the Valheru ripped off. The movie Legend, because
That's a good movie.
both my game and that movie have as the primary antagonist a demon who is the Lord of Darkness. One of my main musical themes contains bits of one of the themes from the movie as a little tip of the hat. The other main thing I stole from are past D&D and LARP games that I've played in or run. The name Eleusis, which is both the world and sometimes the name for a mythological Earth Mother goddess, like a Gaia, is from an Iron Heroes game I ran about 8 years ago. Many character names are the names of PCs from games I ran or people I LARP with, similar to how Garriott put all of his SCA buddies into Ultima, but at an even more egregious scale. I really have no idea what I'm going to do to name NPCs in the next game because I've really just put all of them into this one already. Whoops. So that's what I got. Let's go ahead and hit other Adam. Other Adam.
Okay. Oh, I might go on a while, guys. You might have to cut me off. So I feel like tabletop RPGs are really the first and most direct influence on CRPGs for certain. And my brother is an avid tabletop gamer. It's basically his primary hobby. And we started with like an expert box set in the 80s that he got as a gift. And so we've been, doing D&D off and on, in fact, all the time. Although right now we're playing, which I consider a big inspiration, is GURPS, which is generic universal role-playing system developed by Steve Jackson Games, who influenced Richard Garriott heavily, because which is an interesting cross of the two paths. But yeah, a lot of I feel like CRPGs are all about the writing, so that means books really are some of the biggest influences on a lot of it. And like, for example, I like a lot of the original classic swords and sorcery books. It's like we got Lovecraft, you got Conan, and then you have like some of the, like, my favorite of the old days would be the guy that coined the term swords and sorcery itself, which is Fritz Leiber. This is actually a collection. White Wolf Publishing collected all of his stories a while back and then republished them in really nice books. And he basically introduced the idea of the itinerant adventurer traveling around doing jobs, because he grew up in the Depression era, and he actually was going around doing any work he could to make money at one point. And so he had his main characters, which is Fafford, a tall barbarian ranger guy. I think he is the origin of the 2-weapon fighting that Dungeons and Dragons had for rangers, because he always fought with axe and sword of equal length. And then the Grey Mouser, who is the rogue who fights with a rapier. He's also the inspiration for rogues being able to read magic scrolls in old D&D, because Mouser was an apprentice wizard for a while, and he still thinks he can do it, even though he's not as good as he thinks he is. But those stories are just fantastic, because it's basically Fafford the Great Mouser travels somewhere, they get it on with some women, they get into trouble, they fight their way out, then move on to the next adventure. But funny enough, because as Leiber was able to actually finish their arc by having them in the middle age, find out that they've had kids from past relationships, and find their soulmates and settle down. Like, in what other fantasy world does that happen? So, and then another one who I really liked, and I actually learned about him from Dungeons and Dragons itself, is Clark Ashton Smith. He is kind of the lesser well-known of the Lovecraft Howard pair. He was a poet, and he had to basically do anything he could to make money, because his parents had him so late in life that by the time he was a young man, they were invalids, and he had to do all the work around their farm. And he found out, I can make money writing stories. So in like a 5-year span, he wrote tons of stories and submitted it to magazines. And unlike Lovecraft, he had no problem editing and changing things to satisfy editors. But he produced some of the best short science fiction fantasy stories I've ever read. He's very macabre, has a lot of creepy, weird things. There are definitely elements in Realms of Antiquity that are influenced by Clark Ashton Smith, for sure. And a couple years ago, Nightshade Press collected, it was really hard. I could not find any of his books as a kid, because the collections of his writings were really hard to find. But a few years ago, Nightshade Press put out a 5-volume set that basically collects all of his stories in the order in which he wrote them, along with like differences and changes, because some of them he changed on editorial suggestion. But definitely highly recommended reading. And just for obscure fantasy series, there is one I really liked. It was released in the 80s. There's only 4 books. It was near impossible to find until a few years ago. Amazon put out a new reprint of it. It's the Silverglass series, which I picked up at like the grocery store as a teenager. Gee, I wonder why a teenage boy would be interested in this book. However, it has a recommendation from Fritz Leiber himself on the cover, and it's actually a really good story with a lot of great magic and fighting and mystery. Really good world building. I'm really sad that it never really, after the 4 books, the author kind of disappeared, but it's definitely a really good one. I'm really glad to see you can now get it on Amazon again. In fact, I bought the new print just because I wanted a little bit better cover on that, a little less Boris Vallejo. And probably now as far as books go, one of my other things was The Three Kingdoms, which is also sometimes called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I actually first found out about this from a console game on the Nintendo called Destiny of an Emperor. So then I went and I found the actual books and read them. And it's a tough read because this is a book written in the 16th century in Chinese, translated to English with many variations and interpretations, because over the years that it was existing, every different dynasty was like, well, we like this side, make the heroes on our side look cool and the other ones look lame. So there was a lot of rewrites and changes made along the way. But it's essentially the story of China split, the Han dynasty splitting into 3 separate kingdoms and ending up in like a 3-way war for a short period of time. And like, it was kind of a historical document, but someone then turned it into an opera. So it's a weird juxtaposition of like dry historical, and then you get into these like bigger than life heroic characters doing heroic things. And I can't recommend that for everyone. It's definitely a esoteric read, but it really kind of influenced my idea. If you notice, Rebels of Antiquity isn't about an evil empire and rebels, which is what like every Final Fantasy since the second one has been. It's the empire is gone, because I thought that the idea of an empire there was there and now it's gone is a way better mechanism for storytelling, rather than just the trite do-overs. And some of the other books I really liked, for example, there's a little bit of Edgar Rice Burroughs in my story, in that if you've ever read John Carter of Mars, when he's on Mars, he's also on Earth because he's kind of being projected there. And there's a little hints of that in Realms of Antiquity with your character. And on that note, there was also another old classic, The Chronicles of Narnia. I actually had a second grade teacher read it to us, and she started with The Magician's Nephew, which was book 6, because she said, I'm not going to start the first one. This is actually where it really starts. And I guess someone listened to her, because I know now when they put out the book collections, they put The Magician's Nephew as number 1. But the fact that you had this whole wood between worlds with pools that led to different worlds, that was a very attractive element. And so a big influence. And finally, as far as TV and movies, we didn't have a lot of fantasy back in the 80s, or at least fantasy that was really worth watching. But I would say no one can argue that Realms of Antiquity doesn't have a lot of influence from Monty Python in places. So I just couldn't help myself but include some references. And some of them are kind of deep cuts, because you would have to actually have the show on DVD, because they don't allow YouTube clips of all the old flying circus shows. For example, there was a whole stretch of a skit about blancmange from outer space coming down and eating people. And so, of course, I had to put them in the game because that's just too funny. But I doubt anyone other than a hardcore Python would ever get that. So I should probably cut myself off now and turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in really good company here. I mean, I read most of the stuff. I recently reread the H.P. Lovecraft. I've got a big anthology of his work, and in his stories, he'll mention Clark Ashton Smith from time to time. It's almost like a character in his.
Yeah.
So I put him on the list. I need to read him. Just trying to think of things that haven't been mentioned. I'm a big fan of Michael Moorcock. I've been reading that. Piers Anthony. You ever read his Xanth series? I read those as a kid. Kind of silly, a lot of puns, but I'm a pun guy. So I love those. He's got hundreds of those, I guess. Let's see. Did we mention Secret of Nim?
Oh, no, we didn't.
I think so. That's a great one.
That's one of my favorites. And yeah, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, I don't know if you know this, Mark, I think you were talking about their Dragonlance novels. They've recently started to write some new ones, and they're really good. Dragons of Fate, I think, is the newest one.
I'm reading it.
Those are, yeah, I'm just really impressed. I was kind of going into it like, oh no, I hope this isn't like one of those remakes that doesn't live up to the,
yeah.
But I'm actually really enjoying those too.
Yeah, that's great to see them come back and give some love to the series for sure.
I realize there's one thing that I forgot to put on my list. here, which is the Chronicles of Amber.
Oh yes.
I'm a huge Zelazny fan, and there's definitely some bits that I
On
took from
that note,
Zelazny.
another series, Thieves World. It was an anthology written by all the fantasy writers of the late 70s, organized by Robert Aspirin, who's another really good author. I love that. In fact, Oz is in Realms of Antiquity if you know where to look. But yeah, Thieves World is really good, if very because it's different authors and different writers, and they started kind of poking fun at each other by messing with each other's characters and stuff. It gets really confusing so it's like the first couple books are pretty good, but it starts to get very strange after a while. But it's actually a pretty good classic series, if extremely dark.
Did we mention Jack Vance? I don't know if his name came up.
No, I thought of him when somebody else was talking, but no,
It's
nobody
funny.
mentioned it.
They called the magic system in old D&D Vancian magic because it was based on his idea of memorizing spells and then spells disappearing out of your head. And yet I've never actually read any of his stuff.
It's funny, like some of the Dying Earth stories and running into like, I don't remember the name, but it's somebody's marvelous prismatic spray, and it's like, oh, this is where D&D stuff came from. Like a lot of D&D first run spells are just taken from and made a little less elaborately over the top directly from Dying Earth.
On that note, I just remembered we could probably do this all day. Discworld, Terry Pratchett.
Sure.
I love it. I miss him every day. I'm glad that he basically, when his orders on his passing was, I want the hard drive with all my uncompleted stuff run over by a bulldozer, and it was done.
Gary Brooks, Good Kind.
The Black
Isaac
Company.
Asimov.
Yes.
We stand upon the shoulders of giants.
Inspired by them. Okay, well,
Who wrote the Great Worm Ouroboros? You remember that? That's kind of a difficult read for me.
Well, to be truthful, like Robert Jordan, I couldn't get past one chapter. I was like, all right, this is not my style.
E.R. Edison.
Okay, time to move on to question 2. Question 2 is, do you like to write extensive backgrounds and history for your game? And if it is it, do you give it to the player right up front, like in the manual, like I'm going to just lay it all out and then in the manual, or do you have it in game, being the player discovering it as he goes along? So, and it looks like we are starting with Stefan.
So yes, love writing lore. In fact, I never feel like I've written enough. I have like working documents that I open sometimes multiple times a day to write down things that I discover about the world, which is just another way of saying things I come up with for the world. But so there's a couple things on my approach to writing lore and delivering that lore to the player. It's, you know, you guys are probably similar to me, I think, but the lore is really a foundation that everything's written for the game. So all the all the dialogue is derived from this lore, and the deeper that I understand the lore, the easier it is to write dialogue for the NPCs. From a player's experience, they uncover the lore. It's like World of Antera is truly an open world game, not unlike an Ultima game, and so you can walk and talk to NPCs in any order and do things in pretty much any order you want within the game world. And so you'll uncover the lore and discover the world through your journey and your own unique journey. And there's there will be some like journals you find in notebooks, but the majority of it's really just through dialogue with NPCs and characters within the world. Yeah, so I like I'm just looking at my notes here because there's something that I wanted to touch on and I just left my brain. Yeah, so the first thing that I did, and I did with my team, because at the time when I first started working on World of Antera, I think there was like 5 of us. And we were working on a separate game project, but I was coming to them every few weeks with the next idea for World of Antera, and I'd sort of pitch it to them. But the first thing I did was come up with a player journey. Like, I wanted to understand, before I worried about world building and all that, I wanted to understand what the experience that I wanted the player to have, like what was the purpose of this journey the player was going to go on. And so we came up with a really cool, what we feel unique, sort of player journey. And then from that, I started building the world for it. Of course, I had the world in my head from since I was a child. It's not like, from scratch, I'm like, okay, now I'm going to make this world. It's like, this is a game that I've been dreaming of for a very long time. So it was really easy to tap into that. But with the player journey in mind, it really helped me. It really helped me sort of like ground this world. Oh, there goes the lights again.
I'm here.
Yeah. So, it's like, I don't know, I guess I couldn't see it being done anyway, any other way. I can't see making a game like this without really digging deep into the lore of the world. And I'm talking like the history and major events, and like the world to me is its own character, and I need to know the journey that character went on prior to the player and to getting to meet that character. And I think that's something that we've managed to do a really good job of. But like, it took, like, I think World of Antera was in pre-production for nearly 3 years, maybe more, 4 years, before we actually started fully developing it. And over that time, I had been writing, all like hundreds of documents on the world and lore, and continually iterating on it and pitching it to the team, getting their feedback on it. It was a really long process, and I don't know, like a lot of other indie game developers that kind of get that opportunity because it just happened to be my career, and we happen to be working other projects, and I just took this on as a side project, and then 4 years later it became our main project. So I had a lot of time, to sort of allow inspiration to come naturally. And that was also a really big key to me, is that it wasn't forced. I didn't like sit there and like, crap, I really need to come up with this, region or this part or the side quest or something like that. I didn't have that pressure. I could be sitting in front of the TV watching like Dune or something, and then be like, oh man, get this inspiration for something for World of Antera, and the next thing you know, my laptop's open and I'm typing for an hour. So very, to me, having it be a natural, organic, like process for lore building has probably been the most critical component to our success with story building and lore. So yeah. Did we lose Mark?
I think he's just
muted.
stepped away.
I like how you managed to sneak in one more answer to the first question by just referencing Dune as you went.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, like, my wife lots likes, she's the Harry Potter fan, not actually. I mean, I enjoy Harry Potter, but she's like hardcore Harry Potter. But like, I'll be watching it with her, and then it's funny how like inspiration can come from anywhere if you're just open to it. And yeah, those moments I just love. So whenever I'm watching something, I'm kind of like, from that lens of, what kind of inspiration can you give me here? But Dune's amazing. Nobody mentioned it, but I know we probably all share that. So,
Oh
yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next
yeah.
movie, that next exploration of that world. So yeah, Matt, do you want to go?
Yeah, I was Dune. Wow. Right. I was thinking of when we talked about Tolkien a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
that first section too, and one of the things that always sort of amazed me about him was how much effort he put into his world, and even the languages, creating a whole languages and histories of languages. And I think that, wasn't it true that he basically wrote those novels just to have something to do with the this world that he created. I always wonder if he would have made a game. Like if he was alive today, would he be more interested in making a game than a set of novels? But I always loved that idea. I think even if you don't end up using it all in the game, it somehow still is important because I think somehow it's almost magic. It makes the world feel more coherent when, I remember reading The Lord of the Rings and they're passing through a little town and you get some place names and then that there's probably somewhere you can look up all that and there'll be, reams of text, maybe in the Silmarillion somewhere. I don't know where that gets a lot.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, yeah, Tolkien, he was writing poetry, but he was writing stories on the back of like paper when he was in the trenches during World War One. So he'd been writing and creating all the time. And yeah, the stories are kind of born out of the world that he had envisioned. And he never, apparently the reason why there's so many different versions of his writings is because he kept losing notes. And so he'd just shrug and write a new version from memory rather than try to find the old one. So there's like 3 different versions of how Gandalf and the dwarves meet. So the other thing I just as a fun aside is Elsbrog de Camp got to interview him back in the early 70s. And so he said, we just sat around, smoked, and chatted about writing and stories. And Tolkien admitted to him that he quite enjoyed the Conan stories. I thought that was always funny because Tolkien could clearly not write an actual fight scene. You could describe a battle scene, but not a fight scene. But the idea that he's reading this very, action-oriented pulp-style story is amusing. Anyways, please continue, Matt.
Oh, but yeah, you'd also ask in the question something about how would you integrate the story? Would you make it, I guess you're asking, would you want cutscenes and things of that sort, or big chunks of exposition? I like the idea of being old school. I like the manuals. I used to love it when they would include a little novella or something to, wasn't actually in the game, but gave you something to read. I always love that idea. So that's probably would be my approach. Maybe put some in the game, but I would also like to have maybe some PDFs or something you could read on your Kindle.
Yeah, I had that thought when I was reading this question again, was that, it's like in the old days, we didn't have memory to do text in game. So they had to put it all in the manual if they wanted to give you any extensive backgrounds. And then you even have the games where they'll say, read line something in game. And then that's where they put all the text.
You needed something to do while the game was loading or installing, right? That's when you pulled out like Pool of Radiance, those gold box games that had the player's journal and all this other stuff. But I always I guess the starting place for me is always a map. Like making a map and then thinking about what's the story here? What would it be like to go to these places and what kind of people live there? I haven't gotten so far as to start creating my own languages like Tolkien, but the writing systems and things are pretty cool to play around with. Just kind of gets the creativity juices flowing.
Yeah.
You have to pick the next person.
Oh, I have to pick. I was last time. Let's see. Let's see. Well, Adam, you might as well.
All right. Some Adam Prime here. So
we can segue.
So as I discovered after I released Realms of Antiquity is nobody read the manual. Like, unfortunately, modern audiences just they've been weaned off of ever even looking at manuals. They assume everything is going to be in the game. So, but on the subject of the background, yeah, I've been kind of had the idea of the story and the world going well before even I started creating it, like back to like tabletop campaigns, where I had the idea of the Empire, where the Emperor gets assassinated and the Empire falls to pieces. Definitely was probably post Three Kingdoms reading that I kind of got that idea. And then later on, as I was kind of developing the idea, one of the things I really wanted was to take a lot of the elements that were unique for the TI-99 4A itself. For example, I borrowed the names of 2 towns from just some small games called Wizard's Lair and Wizard's Revenge, because they had in the town of Waymore and the town of Blaylock, and I thought, well, I like those names. I even remember trying to run the adventure construction set random adventure generator on the Apple II, and I put those names in for it to use. Of course, that thing did nothing. I seem to remember waiting like an hour and it didn't generate anything that was really that interesting. So, but like I want to incorporate those names, and then I wanted to incorporate a lot of the elements from Tunnels of Doom, which was the most well-known CRPG on the TI-99 4A in the day. So I wanted the rainbow orb, which was one of the quest objects you had to retrieve alongside the king. And I had the idea that I really like this idea that the orb with the rainbow and all of the colors, yes, pride for sure, but also that it's like diversity, that every individual color has different meanings, and combined they form, light, and that the absence of light, the darkness, the shadow, is ignorance and evil and all of that. And so I really kind of wanted to incorporate those elements into the game. And I was also influenced by the idea of, hey, why don't I make magic into use colors as the magic system? And that was partly inspired by GURPS Witch World, because they did the magic system using colors. Although I don't know if Andre Norton who's the writer of the Witch World series, I don't think that's part of the actual stories. I think GURPS just created that as a way to make the magic system make more sense. But I like that idea a lot, and they would let me like make differences. I actually really like Realms of Antiquity red being both healing and fire, so it's like really powerful school because it can do like two main things you need in everywhere. And so I kind of wanted this idea of that the empire is broken and divided. So the metaphor of the rainbow orb being sundered into 7 pieces and scattered, which come on, every CRPG likes to do that. You gather the pieces of the artifact together.
The rod of 7 parts.
Yes. So the idea being that the orb is the key to not to basically the whole reason, and massive spoilers for Realms of Antiquity here, the whole reason why there's no actual end boss fight, and it just ends with you going home or after making a potential moral choice, is the idea is that you've already done the work. You've assembled the orb. You've reunited people across all of the continent, which Telanua, by the way, is kind of my borked up Latin translation of Tally 9. So that was the kind of I wanted all of that, and I avoided gods and religion for the most part, other than kind of having them refer to the light, which I was worried people would think, oh, he's cribbing off World of Warcraft, but but in the end, that was kind of where I had that framework. And then I decided I didn't want the manual to tell you any of this. I wanted you to find it out for yourself as you explore it in the game, which, because I had plenty of memory for text, I could actually do this without having to actually put it in the manual, which is nice. So yeah, that pretty much, I felt like I wanted the manual to just give you the instructions on how to play the game, like the first part. If you remember, Ultima had their lore book and their instruction book. I only wrote the instruction book. So all right, and now that Mark is back, I'll pass the torch to Mark.
Thank you. So, wow, world building, lore. I mean, it's such a foundational part of the best games. I would say that I spent a fair amount of time developing lore, writing down lore, before really implementing anything on the story side. I wouldn't say before I wrote a single line of code, because that really isn't true, because I was taking an approach of design the engine and let the flurry show from the engine, which is actually a different question that we have that we're going to talk about today, so I don't go too far into that. But before I wrote any code that was going to have any bearing on how the game was going to play out from a story perspective, I wrote a lot of lore. Now, I didn't go full Tolkien on it, and write out languages for different races or things like that, but not many do. And One could argue maybe it would even be somewhat overkill, because ultimately, or maybe not because ultimately, but just a simple fact is that I think that developers that do write out lore in advance, and I think it's true for authors as well as game developers. A lot of it doesn't ever show up in the book or in the game, and that's fine. It's serving its purpose as a foundation. Because what you ultimately want in your book or game, you want it to be, the real refined best stuff. But yeah, I mean, just you put a little more detail on it. One thing in particular I did is I wrote down the different races of the realm and wrote a backstory on each of the races, and I drew a map. I don't remember, Matt, if I started with the map before I started writing about the races, or if it was the other way around. But that I thought your comment there was very interesting about how starting with the map can kind of inspire further thoughts on that. But so as I was putting those things down, that got me thinking about the relationships between the races. And so I started writing into the lore some things about, well, there's these underworld races and overworld races, and there's conflict, and which is kind of a common trope in many fantasy RPGs. But I started to delve into, okay, well, but why is there this conflict, and wrote this backstory on how all that evolved, and some of that ultimately did end up in the game. A lot of it didn't, but this became just a great pile of source material as I think someone else mentioned this, writing the NPC conversations. And it became, at some point I made a design decision that I was going to sprinkle throughout the NPC conversations discussions about this overworld underworld conflict that had been going on for ages. So I think it definitely informs the game content in some very helpful ways, even if a lot of it doesn't necessarily see the light of day. And I guess one additional thing I wanted to mention that to me just kind of builds foundationally on this is there was a point where or actually no, this fits better into the engine story discussion, I think, so I'll save it for that. And in that case, I guess that concludes my comments on the topic, and apologize I'd stepped out for a minute. As far as choosing the next person, is there anybody who has not answered this question yet, or are we ready for the next? Okay, Adam, take it away.
All righty. Yeah, I've written a lot, not perhaps quite as much as Stefan, but there's a number of Google Docs full of world information and old timeline stuff. The earliest version of the game was a direct prequel to Ultima 1, before I severed as much of that as I felt I needed to be legally distinct. And so a fair amount of the backstory and stuff derived from some of the headcanons and like fanfic ideas that I had for Ultima. My map started out as the map of the continent, the lands of the Dark Unknown from Ultima 1. So there's some amount of it that started with that theft, but like we don't know almost anything from what was written in Ultima from this time period. So I really was making all of it up. And then didn't have to change that much when I, severed the connection. So some of the recent history and of course the current world information is in the manual. I really liked the Ultima style of having the Book of History in Ultima 4, the Book of Lore in Ultima 5. I've got the Sage's Almanac for mine. And I fully expect that most of my players are not actually going to read the Sage's Almanac. Um, there are a couple of side quests in the game that require information that's only in here. They're optional. You don't need them to finish the game, but like there's a secret passage that you can find in the crook of the dragon's elbow, and you have to kind of read the geography section of this to know that one of the mountain ranges is the dragon, and that there's a section where it does this, and that's where you have to go for that thing.
Yeah, you're gonna get a lot of people going like, I can't solve this quest, you suck. And it's like
And then somebody will put a freaking walkthrough online and nobody will have to read the book. So some of the older history gets discovered in quests and dialogue and such. Some really ancient history can be discovered in optional side quests. There are some hints to things in unexpected places. There's some art in the background of one of the images in the almanac. When the almanac is written as an in-world document. And it's in the background, like on some tapestries behind some characters, and just one of the pieces of art are some icons whose meaning won't get revealed until like future games. Let's hope I get to future games. But I really wanted it to be something where players could play the later things, see that, and then somebody picks this up and replays it or something and goes, oh, hey, wait, that was what this meant. And while my game, optimistically, the series is very directly Ultima, there's one thing that Ultima did that I'm trying to avoid, which is the constant retconning. Richard very much had a what's best and most fun for this game as his primary goal each time. And as such, in Ultima 6, suddenly that was you, the avatar, that had done Ultimas 1 through 3, which had not been the case in Ultimas 4 and 5. It was some other hero. Towns move around. The Abyss is destroyed, and then it's back, and then it's destroyed, and then it's back. Between Ultima 5, Ultima Underworld, and then back to Ultima 9, and so on. So I've planned out and been as thorough as I could in my world Bible so I could avoid that as much as possible. I might screw up occasionally, accidentally. That happens. That happens all the time in book series or something where an author is just like, yeah, I didn't reread all my books before writing this next bit, and I thought I had it all in my head, but I had this one thing slightly wrong, so oops. It might be that I don't ever actually get later games to have some of the stuff that I'm seeding into this one pay off, but that's what I want to do. But so yeah, it's both. There's definitely a fair amount in here, but there's a lot that I have written, and the fact that it all exists as something that almost everyone has kind of alluded to, but I wanted to say explicitly, is having so much more than is explicitly on screen, but where people might make a reference to a small piece of somewhere without fully explaining, or just a name references something, or just it becomes clear that there's more of the world here than just what the player is directly interacting with, and that makes it feel like a world rather than a theme park, and that's really important.
That is important. In fact, theme park is what like I'd apply to Ultima 9. Like when I played Ultima 9, I realized at some point it's like this is like the NPCs are no more complicated than the ones from Ultima 1. They like say one line to you, and then they're just wandering around in the forest and for no reason, and it was all spectacle. And you bring up also a good point about the retconning that as time has gone on, I've realized that there's a lot of it's what I call the comic book level of writing. Basically, if you're writing for 12-year-old boys, that's the level of difficulty, and you're trying to hit the bar on, where it makes sense to them, but to adults it's like, well, that's juvenile. What is this? which it works okay. I think it only really falls apart like when you see modern reactions and playthroughs where you realize that someone pointed out that Lord British kicks the Avatar back to Earth the moment he finishes the quest. And then in like Ultima 6, they tell you there's a big party at the end of Ultima 5, and you weren't there because you got kicked back home where someone had broken into your house and stolen all your stuff. It's like just yeah, there's a lot of weirdness there. Okay, so I guess we should move on to question number 3, which is, do you like a narrative-driven story in a CRPG where essentially the story starts here, moves here, moves here, moves here, moves here, each, maybe with the occasional small fork, or somewhat, or do you like an open sandbox design where the player can just go anywhere? If you go somewhere, there will be story there. If you're going there because of another story, that's fine. So let us roll the die and see who will be starting. Looks like it is Stefan.
Gotta unmute first. This is a great question. I'm very eclectic in my tastes when it comes to video games. Well, really any media whatsoever. But on one hand, my attention span's quite short, and I need to have, I need to be pulled into the experience, and but on the other hand, I really love story-driven games, and it's often the story that sees me through to the end of a game. If the story is not good and not hooking me, it's frankly rare that the game mechanics alone have me finish the game. Like at some point I'm like, well, I've learned all I need to learn here, and I move on to the next game. But so I've played some games that were just purely story driven. Now I'm not just talking RPGs, I'm talking games like Detroit Become Human, or Heavy Rain, but if I have a preference between them, it would really be the free form storytelling of an open world game. I remember The Witcher 3. The highlight of The Witcher 3 for me was side quests, was just wandering into a location, talking to NPCs, discovering a cool storyline there and following that storyline. And then when I was done that storyline, just wandering freely, aimlessly to the sort of the next location. And so it's like, and this is kind of a funny thing. It's become a bit of a joke here. Skyrim is a pretty big inspiration for World of Antera because we're really, we knew from the get-go that we wanted to create a modern experience that was retro inspired, but really it was contemporary in its approach to game mechanics and engagement. But I've never finished Skyrim. I probably put in like a couple hundred hours into it, but I've never finished it. And the reason why, and I also I see your shirt there, Adam. I didn't finish Breath of the Wild until the day I started Tears of the Kingdom.
Huh.
And it's because there's something about finishing the story that like, why am I going to play it anymore type thing, right? So I was enjoying just wandering around in Breath of the Wild and just doing random stuff and doing shrines and figuring out the shrines. I was just enjoying that I never, plus people told me the ending sucked. So that was probably part of it as well. But the thing is it wasn't just Breath of the Wild, it was Skyrim as well. I just enjoyed being in the world in Skyrim and I never really felt like I had to finish it. And in fact, if I did finish it, then maybe I wouldn't have a reason to play it anymore. So I just never finished it. So it's really, I have a weird relationship when it comes to like story and video games. But I will say that from a game designer standpoint, I really want and believe that you can have, I believe that you can have a really deep narrative with the least amount of words and the least amount of text possible. And that's sort of what I'm trying to really do with World of Antera is breathe life into the story with the least amount of words possible through character dialogue and whatnot, but have a really, a sense of true depth to the lore and the world. So it's an interesting journey that I've been on with regards to that. So, yeah.
For the record, I have also never finished Skyrim. So, and I actually got started. I got Tears of the Kingdom as a Father's Day gift, so I played that and so I played the sequel before Breath of the Wild. Now I have won this one, and I'm now working on winning Breath of the Wild. So
I got it. Yeah, really enjoyed both those series. It's a different kind of a gaming experience, but they're just so well done. Um, so geez, Mark, you can go second this time.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not going to answer the question directly right away, and instead just kind of share my evolution on the subject. So back in the 80s, I loved the Ultimate games, which is certainly no secret. Which were, you know, they were sandbox, they were open world, they were definitely not, you know, linear games, and I loved that. And that was the, you know, the first RPG I played was Ultima 3, so you know I kind of come from that baseline. And then I was exposed to other games along, you know, the course of time. Then at some point I checked out the gold box games, probably Pool of Radiance being the first one. And I seem to recall trying a couple: Pool of Radiance, Curse of the Azure Bonds, I think, maybe another one. But you know, those were very linear games, and I didn't like it. I had a really bad reaction to that, as much as I wanted to like them, because I, you know, I like the whole, you know, D&D setting and all of that. It's like, you know, no, I don't want to be on a set of railroad tracks taking me from point to point to point, even if the journey, you know, is interesting. I want the freedom to say, you know what, I don't care about that right now. I want to go to just wander around in the wilderness, go find some other town, do something there, or even just go to a different part of the town that I'm in, whatever, because that's what I was used to in Ultima. And as a kid, I just wasn't open-minded to another approach to it being perhaps fun as well. I really do want to go back and play the gold box games, though, because I think I could appreciate them now in a way that I just wasn't ready to at the time.
And now you can play them since they were able to clean up the license issue.
Yeah, exactly. I believe they're all available on GOG now. So in fact, I think I probably bought them on GOG, and they're sitting there amongst many other games in my playlist. You know, we all know how that goes. So that was kind of my foundational experience with it. And then of course, fast forwarding in time, many more games played, and I get to the point of writing Noxarcast. And what I decided to do was take a hybrid approach. With Ultima definitely being the game that Noxarcast was inspired most by, there was no question that there had to be, in my mind, an open world sandbox dynamic going on, or it just wasn't going to check the box for me as far as that lifelong goal. At the same time, I thought, well, you know, I think there is some fun that can be had from linear story elements. I don't want a completely linear game like the gold box games, or at least the ones I saw seemed like they were for the brief time that I played them. And I thought maybe I can do a hybrid approach, which certainly there was no precedent for that in Apple II RPGs, possibly in any 8-bit gaming. Not that I was aware of in any event. So you know, this was a case where I was starting to design and code without a net, and I say it in that way because given this is a little bit of a tangent, but given the nature of the game the Noxarcast was, and the fact that in an 8-bit system there's just only so many things that you could do and ways you can do them. It's like I want to do a game that's Ultima inspired, not exactly Ultima, a little different and all that, but at the end of the day, there was certainly going to be a huge commonality there, because there's just only so many ways to write a tile-based RPG in an 8-bit system. And so in the course of doing that, a lot of times I was like, okay, what I'm doing here is very similar to a game mechanic or system that Ultima had, and I knew it's like, okay, this has been tried and tested. I didn't have to worry about, was that going to be fun or was it going to work? For the most part, generally speaking, you know, certainly fine tuning and all that. But when I set out to do this hybrid between linear and open world sandbox, I had no precedent in Ultima or otherwise to work from. And so at that point, I was totally going, coding and designing without a net, had no idea if it was going to work. But of course, that was fun, because it's like, well, opportunity to do something innovative. And what I ultimately ended up doing was, Nox is probably a 90% open world. There's very few areas that are actually gated off, other than just by the monsters are too tough in a particular place. That happens a little bit more, but even factoring in that, there's still huge, vast tracts of land that are available to explore without any conditions. And so what I did though is I wrote a mainline quest, and the mainline quest was fairly linear in nature, and I threaded the mainline quest throughout the dozen or so. There's about a dozen friendly towns, castles, keeps in the realm, maybe a little more. And then there's the hostile locations. That's going to be ruins, and then underworld locations. And I threaded the mainline quest through those various locations, the friendly and the unfriendly ones. And I would say almost every location has some kind of touch point along the way on the mainline quest at different points in time. So, you're not going to be able to experience a part of the mainline quest at any given location at any given time. You would have had to have been referred by an NPC or something, to be along that track. But that was important to me to make all the locations feel relevant. And in addition to that, there were a variety of side quests in the game, and I made sure that every location, every friendly location, probably the hostile. There were side quests in some of the hostile locations too. So I will say every location had a couple of side quests that started in that location. So if the player is exploring, which I love to do, goes into just some random place and they're not ready for the mainline quest content, and ready meaning like they're not able to see it, they don't even know it's there. They could then explore that new location and still have a couple of side quests that could be initiated, that's going to get them going, doing something and feeling like, hey, I found something. So I made sure to do that across all of the different locations. And ultimately from the standpoint of the mainline quest, it worked out. I mean, I'm describing the end state of how Nox Archaeus turned out. And really the key to doing it was state flags, and of which there were very few, if any, in the Ultima games. I think in Ultima 5 there were a couple. In Blackthorn's castle, you might get a different scenario going on with Blackthorn depending on how you ended up there. But for the most part, even up to Ultima 5, the last 8-bit or 8-bit Apple II Ultima, it was pretty much single state. NPCs did not remember. If they told you to do something and you went and did it, and you went back to them, they're still acting like you hadn't done it. And that was just at the time. That's just was normal. We didn't think anything of it. So with Nox Archaeus, I put some considerable thought into designing basically a state management system, which had 256 bytes reserved for state flags, both bit flags and flags that they were more like flag values that would take up an entire byte at that point, to be used by the state management system to keep track of things. And in doing that, I was able to make it so that NPCs would react to the changes in the world, both things you did and otherwise. And then additionally, that allowed me to thread the milestones on that mainline quest throughout the different locations of the game, and make it so that you really did need to go get such and such item before such and such NPC would talk to you. And rather than, you can create an illusion to a little bit. It's like, well, if you don't know to ask the player about the sword, you're probably not going to find it. But if you played the game before, then you could. But all that with the state flag system, non-issue, was able to really gate everything off in the main quest, so that the player did have to go through it, wasn't going to accidentally stumble on something, etc. Except for I did leave one glaring hole in it towards the end that involves asking Lord British for an Ankh, and you need that to do like the end of the game. And I thought about it for a minute. I'm like, well, I could lock that down with a state flag. That's normally what I would do. But then I thought, well, if I leave that open, then somebody who replays the game could, because they knew from before, go and ask him that, and then as a result skip like 2/3 of the game, as well as a particular thread in the mainline quest that it's like, once they knew what was going to happen, wouldn't be as fun for them to be forced to go down a path again that was essentially the wrong path. So for a couple reasons like that, I'm like, nah, I'm going to leave this open. And I'm glad I did, because so many players have had fun speed running the game as a result. There's somebody that got it down to like 20 minutes through some exploits in the game mechanics that I didn't foresee. And then also because of leaving that Ankh keyword unprotected in Lord British's dialogue that I did foresee. The combination of those resulted in like a 20-minute speed run. So, and I was really happy to see all the replay value, kind of come out of that. So, in any event,
not a bug, it's a feature.
yeah. And I can't resist, when players are so happy to, find all that, to do that, which I'm glad of. I always feel this need to say like, yep, and I knew you were going to do that, and I intentionally let you do it. Glad you did it. Kind of just, I want to be part of the excitement. But anyway, that's my perspective on this topic. And let's see who hasn't answered this question yet for being up next.
That'd be
okay. Then Adam, over to you.
okay. I'll assume that's me.
There are two of us.
So, yeah. So, yeah, some part of it for me, I always have enjoyed sandbox, and having, of course, just been doing a lot of playing of a sandbox game recently. One of the aspects of it, and I ran into this also with Realms of Antiquity, is the balance issue. So if you have a sandbox, that's great, but like Ultima 4, now every place has to kind of have the same level of difficulty, the same access points. I mean, well, unless you make a shepherd in Ultima 4, which, like, good luck.
Who does that?
Yeah, you're stuck on an island with deadly swamps and no resources, and the crappiest class in the game. Sure. So that was like part of the challenge. Like, in fact, in Ultima 4, ironically, both new games like Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild and Ultima 4 did a thing of, past this certain point, we're just going to make all the monsters stronger. Like in Ultima 4, it's like after you've done so many moves, I think it's like 10,000, it will expand the monster random generator so it can include all of the strongest monsters at the bottom of the table.
The overworld is level scaled, and I believe was in Ultimas 1 through 5. I don't remember after that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And the same thing happens in Tears of the Kingdom, is after you've like completed the 4 main quest lines, and both now suddenly the monsters that can spawn up to the highest level version, the silver versions, everywhere. So that's like one way to handle it, for sure. But I actually prefer the same approach that you took, which was, let's just make it so that certain areas are, like the monsters get gradually stronger until the point where you're in over your head if you don't have the right equipment. So that's the approach I took with Realms of Antiquity. And another influence on it, my brother is a huge, he loves to research how games were played back in the 80s, because a lot of old school gamers have this idea in their heads of how it was, but they're not actually, their rose colored glasses are making them forget things. And one of the things he realized, what he was telling me yesterday, was, old adventures are really just adventure paths, just like modern day games that, players go from sequence to sequence to sequence. The modules that everybody thinks is how it was, like, well, what about Ghost Tower of Iverness? What about this? And it's like, those were tournament modules. They were played at tournaments. They were not actually narratives. They were a contest. And so, like, the idea of a random dungeon crawl and sandbox traveling around in a dungeon isn't realistic. Like, what everybody was trying to do is tell cool stories. So it is, while sandbox is great, you still need the stories. And I was also influenced by the fact that early on in my tech design, I was going to do the big map, like have the full size world map in a big file, and then read parts of it out, and as you scrolled around, much like how Ultima 4 does it. But I was having real technical issues. I actually could probably implement it better now. But it was like anytime I hit a border edge, it would just stop for like 2-3 seconds, and then you could continue. And I was really disturbed. I didn't like that. It really broke up the gameplay badly. And I realized, like, the Commodore 64 version of Ultima 4 is particularly bad because they're playing music, and then the music gets stuck on a single note when it's crossing a borderline. It's terrible. So that's what I moved to. I'm just going to have singular maps in memory, and then have little, like, if you move off the edge, you'll move to another map, full map. And so the map you're on is always in memory. And I found that actually helped really influence the design, because then I'm like, okay, this map has got like this city, and I'm going to like populate like all sorts of fun stuff on this one map. It helped me really consolidate my ideas and thinking, and guide the design process. Because I've heard people say, like, oh, no, Realms of Antiquity is sandbox, and it's like, yeah, it is. I mean, but it also is. I mean, you do you all start in the same starting location, but I put 2 paths out, so you can actually have 2 different ways to start the game. Like, if after you've left the starting area, I would say it seems like starting area is always the beginning of any CRPG of this design. Now you got to have that little area. Kind of, I mean, you've got the ship in Nox Archaeist, which is kind of the tutorial level, and I've got my little starting area with like a simple dungeon and quest to complete before you move on to other things. And I followed the style of Ultima 7, where they've dropped this idea that, oh, you need to go find Elizabeth and Abraham, and so if you actually follow that plot line, you end up going to every city in Britannia looking for them. And it kind of
Old round robin quest.
mm-hmm.
I did one of those too.
Yeah, so that was kind of my idea, was that if I tell the players go find the 7 towers of sorcery, that then they'll just end up going to each of these different areas, finding stuff to do and trouble to get into. And I did have a couple points where you're literally a guy will send you all the way across the world to the other side to fetch something for him. So because that way I figured, oh, that just help spread the players out, keep them busy, let them find all this stuff, and really made sure that, like, if you go digging and find unique things, you get rewarded. Like, the best treasures and stuff are for those who actually like to explore and really dig into the content. So yeah, I like the sandbox approach. I think you have to be balanced with it and careful so that it doesn't get too boring, or sameness. It's like when you play, for example, any of the games that generate their content procedurally, like Minecraft, No Man's Sky. I play a lot of No Man's Sky. I haven't in a while because, well, it's all just the same. I now see the bones of the procedural generation, and there's just nothing new. So, and I think that's kind of important, is you want players not to feel like they know your engine in and out and they know what it's capable of. So, okay, I think I'll stop there. Let's see, Matt.
I've been thinking about this a lot. We talked I just did the Zelda panel not too long ago, and we were talking about the Breath of the Wild versus some of the older games and whether people like that better or not. I mean, I guess in general, when you're talking about a sandbox experience, I think if it's done well, I mean, this is not really all that brilliant to say, but if it works great, right? If it doesn't work, you're like, okay, I don't know what to do. Where do I go? And you just kind of left with this quest for meaning, I suppose. Now, I always come back to games like Myst and Riven. I played those a lot. Not RPGs, obviously, but I kind of like this idea of just being thrown into this world, and it's sort of your own curiosity that drives you to explore the world. I love that idea and learning about what's happened sort of as you're playing. I like that model, but I've certainly played my share of games too, where I don't feel like I played this game for 2 hours. I don't feel like I made any progress. I don't even know. Am I getting closer to the end? That's kind of frustrating. And I'd also compare it to dungeon masters I've played with over the years, where I don't know if you've had this experience where maybe a dungeon master's put a lot of work into a narrative and a story, and they want to make sure that the party will, go to each leg of their quest. And, again, if it's a really good storyteller, maybe that works. On the other hand, sometimes it feels, well, I wouldn't have done that. You sort of feel like it's not about the party anymore. It's more about the dungeon master. So
I think the term you're looking for is railroading, which is
railroad,
real problem where DM's like, no, you're gonna go be where I wrote the adventure.
A strange force compels you. No.
But thou must.
Thou must. Yeah, I had a different experience with those gold box games than you did, Mark. I always felt like the Pool of Radiance was the first one. I felt like I had more power in that game. And when I went to the second one, Curse of the Azure Bonds, that's where a lot of people prefer that one because it did have more of a story to it. The seven sigils on your arm, and you had to remove each one. So,
Are you saying it felt more sandboxy to you than linear?
Yeah, I felt like it's been a while since I've played it, and again, we mentioned the rose-colored glasses. I probably remember it being a lot, more liberating than it was. But, part of the joy to me too, I was thinking, in an RPG is maybe when you're starting off, you end up in a wrong zone, so to speak. You get your ass kicked, but then you come back later when you're more powerful, and then you're able to, get through that zone. That to me is an important thing. It makes me feel more powerful. I like going back to early zones and just being able to instantly smash all the rats there.
I love that too.
I don't like the ones where you go back and it's level scaled, so you're still at the same level of difficulty. What's the you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that I think some games like Fallout 76 has level scaling, but they handle it well. That certain zones they cap out, so you can come back and kick ass still in that zone. But then, like the higher level zones, no, they'll go up to your level. So
Yeah, it's the hybrid approach like that does sound interesting.
I'm not sure who has not spoke. Who is Adam? Take it away.
This is gonna, I think, basically repeat a lot of what's already been said. Comparing between the narrative-driven story where the story guides the player or the sandbox design, I feel like the former is easier to do well. You can kind of call Ultima 4 an example of sandbox, except there isn't really story that's presented everywhere. It's just you have to do the same things in each of a bunch of places. The locations aren't higher level than each other. It's just in each one you have to talk to whoever tells you about the stone, find the rune, learn the mantra, etc. Skyrim is, of course, a more precise example. It does it partially by doing the level scaling thing, where by 2/3 of the way through the game, you've got bandits trying to attack you who are wearing armor that's worth more than an entire village. And it's like, why do you need my purse? You're fine. The former version, the narrative-driven, those are everywhere. Many, if not most, JRPGs. Certainly, most of the ones that I've played. I don't play a lot of JRPGs, but I've played. You know, a lot of the Final Fantasies are very much. You've got Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. Persona games have a pretty strict narrative. For Western RPGs like Baldur's Gate 2. You could run around and you can, go off and do the side quests for various NPCs and such, but first you've got to escape from Chateau Irenicus, and then you have to make enough money at in the Promenade, and then you have to go to Spellhold to rescue Emily. There's a distinct narrative path. I think my preference is for a mix of the two. Ultima 7 got mentioned already as kind of doing this. It approached this where you could go anywhere and you would find story and things to do anywhere on the map that you went to. But the narrative also gave you a reason to go from place to place in order with the Elizabeth and Abraham thread. I tried to do something along those lines in Dark Unknown. You start just outside the main castle with the game's intro telling you that you're supposed to go talk to the king. You can just go wander off, and I'm sure that Rickles will find some way to break the game by doing that. But, you go into the castle, you talk to the king. In the king's throne room are 2 NPCs that each give you little quests to the 2 nearest settlements. In each of the settlements, somebody there will have some reason to send you to your first mini dungeon crawl or to another town across the map. So everywhere, whether part of the main thread or side threads, I tried to have somebody point you at some place you might not have been yet. I think generally better bespoke handcrafted narratives will come from the former, from a narrative driven story. However, and that's obviously because you can control the narrative. However, the latter sandboxy stuff is what's going to create these emergent stories that, partially due to an out of game humor or amazement, will be really satisfying to think about and remember and retell, that weren't planned by the developer. And I'm glad that both are out there. I did finish Skyrim, and then Skyrim being one of those games, unlike, as I understand it, Breath of the Wild, you finish Skyrim, you can just keep going, do more side quests, install DLC, whatever. I beat Alduin and put the game down so that I would actually get anything else done in my life. But I prefer to see. I prefer a mix. I want you to be able to go wherever. I want there to be stuff for you to do and story and backstory and such for you to find, but for there to be enough of a strong narrative thread that the game does feel like it tells a very consistent story that can have the kinds of narrative beats and twists and skillful craft that you would get out of a book or a movie. And that's really, really hard to make happen if you don't know what order and by what tack players will engage with parts of your story.
Yeah, it reminds me, I think one of the principal creators of Final Fantasy made some disparaging comments about sandbox, no, you have to have this perfect crafted experience, and you can see it in every Final Fantasy after, I think, a 7 or 8, where there's no longer a world map. You just are going from where they want you to go, from step 1, step 2, step 3. There's no, you might as well just be watching a movie. There's no forking, no choice. And I wish they hadn't gone that direction. I'm kind of hoping maybe they see the success of Tears of the Kingdom and think maybe we need to rethink this, So, all right. I think next question. So, when you were writing your CRPG engine, now did you write it to support the story that you kind of had crafted in your mind, or did you want to just get that actual engine done first and then put the story into it? And we will see who is going first. Looks like it is other Adam.
All right. Amusing that this is the one that puts me up first. This is the one that I have the least written for because I kept realizing that what I wanted to say for this better went in the next question. Neither quite applies for mine. I kind of made the engine to support Ultima 5 and then wrote a story that I could tell in an engine that would support Ultima 5. And the places where those boundaries didn't quite work are the next question, really.
Okay.
I did know the basic story that I wanted to tell before I had written a line of code. But certainly the specifics of some of the quests or how you got from point A to point B did wind up being constrained by engine limitations. So if I had to pick one, I would say I had a story in mind, but when I came up with that story in the couple of years before I started writing any code, I knew that eventually I was going to be trying to do it in an engine that was something very like Ultima 5. So everything that I thought of as I was building that story, I knew that that was what the engine was going to eventually try to look like, and how successful it would wind up being or where I would go past that or whatever is something that I wouldn't discover until I started writing code. But I did have in mind that that was what the general shape of the engine was going to be.
Okay.
And I will throw to Matt next.
I really liked your answer. I think I'm probably 100% engine first. That's what the main thing is. Like, my thought was, well, if I can't get the engine to work, if I can't get this, engine part done, what use would the story be? I have to look at another medium. So definitely that tack. I think too, I've been thinking, again, it's kind of hard not to bleed into the next question with this, but just thinking like, how might I tell this story? How might I bring in these characters? And I'm starting to wonder how difficult would that be? Would I be able to find some assets that would allow me to, I got the image in my mind, but yeah, I might be dealing with some limitations of the engine as well. So it's very intertwined.
Who's going next?
I have to say, yeah, go ahead, Adam. We'll pass the baton to you.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of had the thought on when I was crafting this question. I was like, I remembered reading an interview of guy that wrote Donkey Kong clone for the TSR 80 color computer, and they were asking him all sorts of questions, and he was giving all this great technical information about how he solved this and got the fixed. And then they said, well, what kind of games would you write? And he's like, huh? It's like he had no imagination whatsoever. He was able to perfectly clone an existing game, but he had no idea how to make his own. He's just a pure engine creator. And I actually ran into this when I was writing Realms of Antiquity. I actually created a scripting engine of sorts to drive all of the transactions with NPCs. And I realized while I was writing, I was like, I could genericize this. This could literally be a generic engine for any CRPG. But I kind of abandoned that because generic's expensive and you end up doing a lot of extra work to make something that can work with every case. And it was like, no, I'm going to make it focus only on my game. So it's all going to be specific, and it can't be, no one can replace the data files and make a completely different game out of it, for example. And yeah, I had a story in mind when I was writing, and I was writing pieces of the engine. And so I kind of was definitely in hand one thing in particular I really like to do is when story informs the engine, that you're like, I want to do something that the players have been used to this being the case the whole game, and now boom, big surprise, something new. And and then it's like, whoa, I didn't know the game could do that. So, and in fact, I ran into this with in the final dungeon in Realms of Antiquity. There's an area of a maze where I make it so that the tiles are look like walls, but they can be traversed. And because the game doesn't make sound when you hit a wall, you can't tell where you are. And eventually, during my beta test phase, the testers are like, dude, this is insane. I am like completely lost. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where I am in this maze, and it's driving me crazy. So I had to put little empty floor spots just so they could at least see that they were moving. But that's like the only place in the game I did that, and it was only in the in-game sequence, so that way it was like a big shock at the end. And I thought that was a really good thing to add in. All right, let's see, Stefan.
Yeah. Well, we use Unity, and we came from, as a studio, we came from Game Maker Studio 2 to Unity. And we, back when we used Game Maker, we had the company that owns Game Maker, Yoga Games, make some custom changes to the engine for us to meet our needs. And with Unity, we're hoping to get source code access so that we can make some changes, but it's not really for story necessarily. Although I kind of chalk up the whole player experience to the story, but or relate to the any experience within the game as a storytelling vessel, whether it's a simple game mechanic or a UI, or a bigger game feature. But when it comes to game features in the game, so specifically for storytelling, there's not really any limitations that Unity puts upon us. Certainly not with like the engines that you guys are working with. But when it comes to game features, and there are a lot of custom components that we had to build to be able to do the things that we're doing, and we continually have to build these tools, and these are like extremely robust things that we're doing within Unity that no other pixel art game has done, in the way that we're doing it. So there's a lot of challenges around there. It's a very different experience for me. Although I do program, I do write code. I haven't done it for World of Antera in a really long time because we have developers. We have 4 developers that are working on 4 developers that are working the game full time. So, really the I get to have these big ideas and big dreams and pass it off to them, along with all my design and documentation, and then see it come to life through their efforts and support them in that. But yeah, I think, like, I will say this though, me personally, innovation is really important, and innovation comes in so many little ways. But with innovation comes real big challenges. And part of the reason we moved to Unity was because our last project we worked on in Game Maker Studio, the CTO of Yo-Yo Games told me at a GDC, he said, "This is the most advanced Game Maker game we've ever seen." And I knew, okay, that's as far as we're taking this engine. It's time for us to move on, because we don't want to be like, we're such a small studio. We don't want to be the trailblazers of an engine. So that was part of the catalyst of us moving to Unity. And it's possible that we move from Unity with any future project. But I will say this, because I do think this is interesting, and this is a bigger conversation that maybe another roundtable is set for, but we're really building a platform for creating open world pixel art games. So we have a real heavy focus on tools. When you have and this is different than when you're making your own game, because I have done that. I've made my own game where I wrote 100% of the front end code and did the design work and some of the art, and hired artists to help me and stuff like that get there. I'm building code that just I'm going to interface with. That's very different than I'm building code or tools that I'm going to pass off to somebody else to use, because now you have to have usability, right? They have to be intuitive and stuff like that. And it's a lot more challenging. And this is part of the reason why when teams scale up, productivity doesn't scale with it. I think like the industry kind of accepted amount is that a team member, as you scale up, it's like 30% more productive. Like when you have one person, they're 100%, and you have two people, they're 130% together, and it sort of like scales, kind of like that. But we're building a platform for creating open world pixel art games, and we envision ourselves using this going forward. But we'd also like to pass these tools off to players at some point. That's a whole nother, like you touched on, Adam. It's really complicated, and it's likely we won't ever achieve that goal. And that is just becomes an in-house thing that we use to continue to make content for World of Antera or a sequel. But I'm fascinated when I hear you guys talk about the challenges you face, because it really, really is different. I think the bigger challenge, I think the biggest challenge that I face is the scope. Like, like this is too big, guys. This is going to take us months. We need to bring it down. I'm sure you guys deal with that too, but it's really through a different lens, a different, a whole different set of constraints than what we have. But yeah, I don't think we really hit any barriers with regards to the engine and storytelling, which is really interesting. It's not something I've thought of till you asked that question. So yeah.
Nice.
Geez, Mark, did you go? I don't think you did.
No, not yet. So I'm.
Oh, you're last, right? This time.
It's my turn to follow on to the end, and happy to do that. So for this topic, there was never any question in my mind that I was going to do the engine first. For two reasons. One was that was Richard Garriott's philosophy, at least on Ultimas 1 through 5 on the Apple II. And I certainly thought that it's like, hey, if this worked for him, and obviously it did, let's stick with what works. And understanding, of course, there's a variety of different other approaches than the one that he took, but definitely I thought what he did with Ultimas 1 through 5 worked very well. And especially from a story perspective, because there wasn't that much story in the earlier ones, but like 4 and 5 were especially 5 where there was a lot of story. I thought that worked very well. And the other reason is the one that Matt mentioned, was just that while I had tried to make games before, had built chunks of games in the past, largely as a kid learning to program, I had never finished anything. And I would never I had never even like finished the engine. I had gotten as far as like finishing the graphics engine portion of the game engine. I think that was as far as I got as a kid, but there's certainly a lot more to a game engine than just the graphics engine. So I wanted to make sure that, like, hey, before I start investing a bunch of time in story, let's make sure that I can actually pull this off from a coding the engine perspective in 6502 assembly on an Apple II computer. Wasn't exactly a given that was all going to work out, but of course it did. And as I was designing the engine with that sort of strategy in mind, I definitely had concept notes for what I was wanted the game to be, game for the game story, etc. Some of which I had accumulated before I had sort of wrote a single line of code, and then there were other notes I was sort of dumping in as I went. Much like with Nox Chaos 2 Dragon's Mirror, the sequel that I'm working on right now. I just got started on that like a month ago. So, but I've got a pile of concept notes that have been accumulated over, years really at this point. But I think the key thing to me, and the reason I describe them as concept notes, is they're very malleable They can be massaged how, you know, in all sorts of different ways to fit the contours of an engine. And so while I had concept notes with the original Nox Arcade as a game, as I was building the engine, there was nothing that was that was really rigid at that point. And there were a lot of things that were in those concept notes that just never got developed out further because of the way the engine ultimately turned out. Like I had this idea at one point of like, oh, maybe it would be cool to have ships in the game that the player traverses the map on, make it so that you can enter the ship and it takes you to a mini map of the ship, and you're like in the ship's hold, and there's like barrels and other containers, and you can like store your loot in the different, you know, containers in your ship. And, you know, it just kind of snowballed from there of like ideas what to do with this little, you know, mini ship thing. But that turned out to just not be the direction technologically that the engine went in. And so, you know, that page in the concept notes never fleshed out into anything more than just that. The other key thing I did though is, even though it was an engine first strategy, being that this was an 8-bit platform with limited resources, 128K RAM, you know, less memory in the computer than the size of an average email, just the text without images, as well as, you know, disk space. You know, we're talking about disk space. The floppy 5.25 floppy disk was less than 200K, and a CPU that ran at 1 megahertz. I mean, this was a constrained system from every direction. I could easily have written an engine that would have taken up all those resources, because there's so many features, so many things you want to do. And what shapes 8-bit games is the constraints. So I believe I will call this foresight. Had the foresight, fortunately, to see that I could literally run myself out of memory developing, building out the engine, and see that I didn't, that wasn't a good thing to do for two reasons. One is bug fixes that were invariably going to come up in beta testing. I needed to have a slush fund of memory to be able to deal with bug fixes. Some bug fixes don't cost any more memory. Some of them cost a considerable amount of memory. Really glad I did that, because there was definitely that slush fund of memory was definitely put to good use solving bugs during beta testing. The other reason I didn't build the engine out all the way to maxing out the disk space, maxing out the memory, etc., is because when I did, looking ahead, I thought, well, when I do flesh out the story and hang the story on the engine, especially since I was going for a hybrid between sandbox and linear elements, I thought, you know, this is going to be like the vast majority of content is all going to be kind of standardized, and you just run it through the engine and it does its thing. But on that mainline quest, as the story is unfolding, I thought there are going to be a couple of points, I suspect, where for dramatic effect, I'm going to want the game to do something different that's sort of outside the parameters of what the engine normally does. For example, after you defeat the cult, getting towards, you know, like the Act 3 of the game, and when you defeat the cult in the High Cultist Temple, there's a big bad calamity that happens, and so I needed to save the player from that calamity. So I had the Arcus Magus in Northeld Castle, you know, one of the friendly locations of the realm, teleport the player from this High Cultist Temple deep down in the underworld, teleport the player back to Northeld Castle, and then explain to the player that, you know, the order has been watching their activities and they saw what was unfolding and they intervened to blah blah blah. But to do that, to go from this battle, you know, battles are cookie cutter, that's all engine standardized, to then at the end of the battle, I didn't mention this before, at the end of the battle, have a pop-up window of text where your enemies are then talking to you and saying something, which is exactly what happened in this High Cultist battle. You know, that was not a standard feature of the engine. So that had to get hard-coded basically directly in for this scenario. And then after that, at the end of the battle, you know, normally engine combat, you know, is like, okay, either you die at the end or you survive. And if you survive, you get booted back to the map that you were on. But in this case, it's like, no, we're going to pop up this text where the enemies talk to you. And then after that, we're going to teleport you to this other location, which basically means I had to do an intercept in the combat exit routine to detect that was the battle that was going on, you know, via state flag, and then write code to essentially hack into the gate spell routine and feed it parameters such that the gate spell routine would allow itself to be cast and transport the player somewhere else without it looking like it was a spell that was cast by a player, just borrowing some of that code. And so doing all of that, the logic was all very doable. I had structured the game engine in a way where it was very modular and can be flexible like that. But at the end of the day, it cost memory, it cost disk. But because I held back, I want to say maybe 10% of the system resources I held back for bug fixes and for hard coding these special scenarios within the story, I was able to do things like that. And so in the end, I was really pleased with how it turned out, taking a engine first approach mostly, but then with a little bit of a holdback so that when the story became more clear, I could then still sort of enhance things a little bit along the way.
Yeah, flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. Keeping flexibility.
Nice.
And that's it. So back over to you,
All
Adam.
right. So we got one last question, which has two parts to it. It's, did technical limitations alter your game story? And did you actually aim to implement something specifically to achieve a story milestone of some kind? So
you haven't gone first yet. I feel like
I think that's, yeah, I think I
should just go ahead and do that.
And we'll go first. Yeah, I was having some flashbacks there when you were just talking about the 10% and fixing bugs, because I ended up doing a lot of alterations after the fact to account for things. For example, players were unhappy that they couldn't reload their game in combat, that if they were stuck in a combat they couldn't win, that they just have to basically suicide themselves before they could even reload. So I had to have like a reload, make the reload work in combat, you know.
Old days we called that the ON-OFF switch.
Yep, exactly. And another aspect was when I added in the ability to basically return a return spell, more or less. And one of the things that I ran into was I hadn't planned on that in initial design, and there were maps where you would take like a boat across somewhere, and then what happens is that boat stays where it's left. And if they teleport it out, they can't go back to that location ever again. So that could potentially be game-breaking problems. So because it tracks, the boats are state tracked everywhere. So
those are the kind of bugs the testers to flush out, because we don't think of them.
Exactly. Yeah, no, testers are really good for that. So as a result, I had to add to my engine, okay, I'm going to add in a flag for the map header that says this map return spell doesn't work on it. You know, that way I could basically stop them from trapping themselves. And then it would just be an in-game explanation of, oh yeah, no, the spell doesn't work down on this, in this deep dungeon place, you know? So I had, that's like an example where I had to actually implement something to address something else. Although that's not really story related. So for story though, one of the things I did implement was the idea of, I really noticed, like past games, as you said, where you would go and do a quest and go back to the NPC and he would just say the same lines, like no tracking of the player's actions. It's like probably the number one sin of old CRPGs, and they can be forgiven if they're old enough because they really didn't have the memory to track state like that. But we don't have an excuse, not in the modern day. So
Well,
I,
we are still working on those old systems, but we also have the benefit of modern sensibilities to help us prioritize where we're using the limited resources that we have, as well as stand on the shoulders of giants and see, okay, well, they took it this far. How can we take it just a little bit further?
exactly. And like one of the things I implemented was that not only that and this was tricky to do, was maps changed. Like, for example, one of my areas in Realms of Antiquity is a cursed woods, and it's very much Stranger Things, the upside down feeling when you go there. In fact, I added a monster that looks like the what do you call it, the Demogorgon into the monster list just for fun. But after you've successfully cleansed the area, the map changes and the area is now verdant and good looking. And that was really hard to implement because I essentially had to add in invisible mobs at map edges to take you to the old map. Once you cleanse the area, it would delete those mobs on other external maps so that then you could go into the proper cleansed area. But there was a couple bugs with that where guys actually managed to get back to the old land, and so I had to do some finagling to say, okay, well, no, you can't go there right now, so to block it off. But that was like really worth to me achieving, because then the player feels like, look at that, I actually changed something. And pretty much everywhere with NPCs, like especially in the taverns, where I had it so that if you've achieved a quest thing, the rumors change. Some of there are new rumors to hear in addition to the regular ones. And one map I actually did it that it was the same map in memory, but the header allowed it to reference the same original map, but it has different mobs, mobile objects. And so that way I could have the city of Oshaven, where it's like, ruled by the overlord, in anarchy, or no longer ruled by the overlord and at peace. And so that way, like little city guards who would charge you money to come into the city, they're gone when you've done the one thing. And if it's in anarchy, there's hostile mobs wandering around and businesses aren't open and stuff like that. So I really liked implementing that in the engine to make that work with the story, and that the player really feels like they're actually really impacting the world. Probably the big one is there's actually a hook. I don't know how many people, in fact, I don't know if any testers discovered it, is that there is a spaceship in the game. That's Expedition to the Barrier Peaks from old D&D all the way. And essentially you can push a button in the ship and it will redirect a meteor to fall down on the area right before the big bad guys lands. And what it will do is it will just destroy the entire area and leave a crater and wipe out most of the fighting you would have to do. And you can actually just go through and get to the enemy's land without any trouble. So, but it's like, it's worth, both paths work. It's just one is takes you a lot longer to get through. And then there's also like a little boss fight with a giant spider that you have to do if you take the other path. So, but it's like, oh, this saves time. but it's kind of it's hinted at in other places that you can do that. But I just like throwing like little things like that in a game, because it just makes every experience different for every player, Okay, I think that's me. Let's go to other Adam.
All right. Yes to both parts of the question. So just to go through some examples, I wound up taking out or severely modifying. I had some mystery side quests I wanted to do. Those are really hard to make work the way that I wanted to do it in a keyword response dialogue system, because you can't respond in certain ways. And you can't, like, if it was an Ultima 7 style system where you're clicking things or whatever, I can be like, all right, you can think to ask this if your int is high enough or if you've gotten this clue or something. It just it fell apart enough that I decided it wasn't worth putting time into trying to figure out how to. There's still one mystery that made it in, but there's one that I had high hopes for and then just never cracked how to make it work properly. I'm not sure how much I implemented that made the story go in a particular way. Although I guess there are a couple of examples. I definitely implemented stuff to make specific quests or beats go in a certain way. To get into a hidden magic academy, you have to cast a couple of spells to prove your worth. So I had to implement listeners that were separate game objects that listened to see if you had cast this spell, and they're built into the location. So I didn't have to hard code into the spells. Did you cast them at this location? And this touches on what Adam brought up with earlier about genericizing your code. Like, for a long time, I tried to. My game doesn't have a party. You're solo through it, but I wrote as much of the code as possible, not assuming that, so that I could maybe reuse the code later in something that did you. And eventually I would get to the point where I'm like, okay, I meant to have this game done like 4 years ago. I'm just going to start taking shortcuts. And so now I'm going to need to go through and strip out a bunch of stuff to make stuff work. But there was effort put into some amounts of genericizing early on. At one point, I changed how trees work in town maps. Originally, it was like Ultima 3 or 4, where I just put forest tiles down, and so they blocked line of sight like a forest does. But then I switched to Ultima 5 style individual trees, and that meant in one town I had to take this NPC that I had hidden in a forest grove and come up with some other way that made it hard to find her because nothing blocked line of sight anymore, so she was just standing there. That you can't drop objects in my game did influence a number of bits. I never implemented dropping because I didn't want to have to figure out how to make sure you didn't drop a quest object. I didn't want you to be able to lose something. I had to put a bunch of effort actually into, like, I have chests that only contain their contents once. And then if you go back into that dungeon later and open it again, it'll have like 1d10 gold, so you don't get nothing, but it no longer has a whole bunch, so you don't want to just keep grinding the same area or something. But if there was a chest that had a quest object, I had to go through an entirely separate thing to check and see when you left that zone if that object was in your inventory, and if not, pretend you had never opened the chest so you could come back and get it again. And I had one idea where there was going to be, you're going to set up this magic ritual and there was a pentagram and you were going to put reagents on the 5 points of the pentagram. Well, you can't drop stuff. And in a tile-based game, finding the 5 points around a pentagram do not line up properly.
No.
And so that whole thing just got completely rewritten. Another good example, again, not so much for story per se, but I have a dungeon that is specifically a throwback to older non-Ultima games, specifically Bard's Tale and to some extent the old Might and Magics. So it has riddles, it's got writing on the walls, it's got tiles where wind blows. But at the point that I started working on this dungeon, your only source of light was a light spell. So it was actually because I wanted to have these wind tiles like Ultima 3 dungeons did and some Bard's Tale dungeons did, that I bothered implementing torches. And I really wanted a spinner tile. But I didn't do my dungeons as first person, like Bard's Tale or Ultimas 1 through 5. They're top down. So I wound up doing 2 different kinds of spinner tiles. One that just makes you dizzy. And so when you hit any movement direction, it just randomly picks which way you move. which was interesting because there I stole a little thing from Zork 2, where one of the 4 directions will not get picked until you've turned off the spin. But you can see which way you went in that. So it doesn't have the same effect as like Bard's Tale, where stepping on a spinner disables your compass until you manage to figure out which way you're looking again. So I actually, in the level of the dungeon that has the full-on spinner, I have 4 copies of the map, one where north points up, one where north points right, etc. And when you step on the spinner, it randomly moves you to one of the other maps and then randomly takes every NPC and object. Well, no longer randomly, it's already picked which one you're going to, but moved them with the proper amount of rotation to drop them in the right spots of the map. So the entire map rotates underneath you. This was an incredible amount of work for one little thing in a dungeon. And I only use it in that one spot.
That makes it a memorable dungeon, and then it really freaks people out. I had the same thought I was going to have, is that if your lead character is confused and in realms of antiquity, I would mess up the direction arrow. So if you tried to move around, you'd move in random directions. I decided not to implement that because that's getting into meta. Hey, stop screwing with my interface.
That sounds like the drunk feature that I implemented in Rockstar Chaos.
I did also do it as a drunk feature.
Press a movement key, and instead of doing what you want, it just rolls a random number and picks a key. Nope, you're going to move that way.
And every now and then you say hick. Yeah.
There's got to be some kind of little text. Around that.
Originally...
I recognize the hick from Ultima that was like talking to the thieves in the one of the guilds that was like in some kind of sailor town, and all the thieves were drunk.
Oh yeah. I was gonna have a drunk state, but I ended up replacing it with a different state, just because I was gonna have it that the longer you stayed in a tavern or pub, that your characters would get more and more drunk. But I couldn't really decide what. I didn't want to punish players for wanting to get information. So inferring that you have to drink alcohol to get information is not the best message. And then the other part of it was just, I'd rather use this state for something else that's a little more fun, So I ended up just leaving that out. Sorry, I interrupted you, Other Adam.
No worries. There was one more thing that I thought of while you were talking that I did implement to make the story work better. In my dialogue system, I very early on had implemented it so when you say a keyword to somebody, it would check a state flag, because I do have a ton of those also, and possibly have 2 different responses. But eventually I had the idea, and I originally did it so that you could ask 2 different things and get the same response, like, plural or something, and so I set it up so if in the data, the response to something is, dash right bracket, so an arrow and then another keyword, it jumps to that keyword response instead. So you could say guild, or you could say guilds, and get the same response. And I initially did this just so if I changed one, I didn't have to remember to change the other. The data was only in one spot. But then I realized that every time I did an arrow, I had the opportunity to check another state flag. And so I could have a single response have more than 2 possible responses, because one could directly have the response, and then the other state flag could arrow to a otherwise unreachable piece of dialogue, which I mostly did by putting underscores in, because the player can't type underscores. I have one NPC that, depending on where you are in the story, has over 40 different things he will say when you first approach him and say hello.
Nice.
And it's kind of mind-bending to look at and try to figure out. It's not very editor friendly. it's not very developer friendly to look at it because it was kind of not the original intent. And then but once I had it in, it very much got used to make people respond to the changes in the world, and also to have people tell you what was necessary to make the narrative flow better. And it's probably one of the bits of the system that I think it makes the game. It's possibly the most memorable step beyond what like Ultima 5 did that my system took.
No, that's pretty impressive. Just from a technical question, is all your dialogue stored in like one location, or is it stored along with the NPC in question? So those 40 responses are all kind of packaged with that NPC.
There is a single variable that the editor writes all of the dialogue in the entire game out as a single JSON object. And then when the game loads, it unpacks the JSON object into a variable that's just a giant hash of, so the NPC has, what is my conversation tree? And that can change also. Like when you go from Act 1 to Act 2, there's a handful of NPCs that just, screw it, too much has changed. They just get a whole fresh tree. But most of the NPCs, I just have a handful, if any, responses, depending on how much they know. Random farmer doesn't necessarily know what you've accomplished, but the king and the head of the captain of the guard and such have entirely new dialogue trees. But the dialogue is all stored in one giant hash table variable, and each of the NPCs just has a pointer to which key in that hash is their dialogue.
Yeah, that kind of informs to another difference between real retro and modern platform retro, because we can't do that, me and Mark. There's no way. I mean, I have a little more memory on the TI, but even then I would have to load all that stuff, which means the start of the game, it would take forever for it to load in the memory. So it's not worth it. Like, we just have to store stuff on disk, or and only load it in as needed, which kind of informs the design. So that's very, really interesting.
I admire but do not envy the restrictions that you and Mark work under. And I think it's like restrictions breed creativity. And I think it's really interesting to think about what I might have done if I had been constrained. But I've also been enjoying and shooting myself in the foot repeatedly with not being constrained.
Yeah. Anyway, I think if you're done, do you want to pick the next person?
Sure, let's go to Stefan.
Very interesting stuff. There are a number of things that I've had to change in terms of concepts for storylines or story segments within the game, that now I'm gonna have to change again because as our project evolves. So I'll give you one example. Currently, we did release like a 15-minute gameplay of our alpha demo, and in that video you will see that as the character walks through the world, they load into another scene, and then they walk through that scene, they load into another scene. So it wasn't, I couldn't just, with the existing tools, I couldn't just design a story in which the player had to follow an NPC across the world or through some areas. Because of that system, we'd have to write some custom loading and character management so that they, that player knew, that NPC knew where to load in and stuff like that. But we're now experimenting with continuous multi-threading loading of our environments, which is again something that modern engines and systems allow us to do. So, we do use multi-threading. We also some, obviously the GPU plays a role, but there's some things we intentionally pass off to the GPU and stuff like that. But in this case, we're experimenting with having the environments load on on a thread so that the player doesn't notice any load time, and then you just seamlessly walk through the environments. The interesting thing about our game is that our environments are a combination of procedurally generated locations and handcrafted stamps, as well as fully handcrafted chunks of environments, or the entire environment is handcrafted. So you don't really know when you're playing, you walk into an area, what it's going to look like. We don't even know really ourselves either, other than through our balancing and whatnot. But so you're not just loading the next location that's been handmade, it's generating the next location, combining it with these handcrafted elements. And so that's all the stuff that we're trying to have happen on these other threads. And hopefully we're able to achieve that, because it opens the door up to some more fluid storytelling moments within our game. The other thing from a dialogue standpoint is we have built a dialogue editor, like a custom dialogue editor, because you're right, Adam. It's like really can be mind bending to have to, and I'm sure, with Realms Antiquity and Nox, you guys, the challenge of writing text, a dialogue that will make sense to the player, especially when they're freeform typing keywords. It's really a unique way to write dialogue. But in our game, we're attempting to take it even further. And so we had to write this custom dialogue editor. And then on top of that, it had to be localizable. So we had to be able to externalize all the dialogue so that we can pass in different languages. And, that's a whole other can of worms. But it'd be great to show you guys at some point the dialogue tool that we did make. I think it'd be really interesting, to share that with you guys. But there are like really multiple paths to our dialogue. There's the auto-generated keywords where you just click on the word and continue on with the text. There's the free form where I can just type in a keyword myself. And some of the keywords that I would type in myself may just be general lore, or it may be driven by that NPC specific dialogue. We have a number of flags that would dictate whether the type of response you get. We have flags that dictate the way the NPC relates to you from a reputation standpoint. We have flags that like whether the NPC, if you're not wearing any clothing, for instance, the NPC will respond differently, or if you're wearing different clothing. We're designing this really cool area right now that's like pirates have taken over this old rundown village, and there's like a prisoner in there, and so you can sneak in and steal the prisoner. You can go in and try and kill all the pirates, but you can actually don pirate gear and walk around freely somewhat among the pirates and talk to them. And when you think of all of these flags that we currently have in the game and all the ways in which the player can interact with the dialogue, the way that we store our dialogue in separate nodes that sometimes are shared among NPCs, like general knowledge within a region, is any NPC can access that shared general knowledge. And then you have to deal with like gender and all of these really interesting challenges. Our dialogue editor it's not quite there yet, to be honest. We're about to rewrite the whole thing, but it has to allow for all of this to be managed and maintained as we grow and develop the game. I would say that we didn't know this at the start, but it's going to be our most complicated system in the whole game. There are more technically advanced systems like our lighting engine and the procedural generation and stuff like that. But from pure complexity and scope, and by the time the game's done, the dialogue system is going to be really, really crazy. Different answer than I think the question kind of speaks to, because of the nature of our team and the engine we're using, but still really fascinating, stuff that a lot of times developers don't talk about these things. We just whittle away, in our rooms or offices or whatever, and you don't really get to share these interesting aspects of game development. So great question.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. Maybe we should in a future roundtable like show off our
it'd be super cool
dialogue engines. Which, by the way, I actually avoided allowing them to type in keywords. I just feed them the keywords because I'm like, I don't want to have to parse strings.
Yeah, totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that string parsing is really interesting in assembly.
Yeah, aka not fun.
We talked about doing some parsing, but then we realized that we don't really need to. We can just search for the entire word. And then we can have same words all give one response if we want. And then we can also have one keyword that has like a dozen responses and then just randomly pick one of those responses. So, there's a ton of flexibility, of course, in using a modern engine, but however, when you look at what we're trying to create, a similar experience to what you guys created, to what Ultima created. And when you kind of open the doors up with that in a modern engine, it can become really unwieldy and nearly impossible to maintain and tell a cohesive story. So certainly a big challenge that we're dealing, but I think we're coming at it in a really healthy way. And part of that is because we're really keeping it simple. Like the system's really complex, but in terms of the way that we deliver the dialogue to the player, we're keeping that really simple. And yeah, it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, when you
Definitely.
mentioned procedurally generated, it reminded me that, yeah, I do actually have procedural generation in Realms of Antiquity with the battle maps. Because I at one point was just going to have static maps. Like Ultima 5 has 16 maps, and it just reuses them over and over. And I was going to do the same. But after I went to the full memory card, I was like, why don't I write my own battle map generator? So it's literally every tile has like a little mini script saying, like, these graphics, these two tiles randomly scatter patterns on the map, and big objects do n number of random trees or rocks. And so it works pretty good. The one thing it is possible to make maps where somebody's trapped, and because I don't have the cycles for it to pathfind every open square to every other open square. That's like an n squared operation. Assembly could do it, but it would be literally, you'd be waiting 4 seconds for the battle map to pop up. So, and then it might even get stuck. I've had pathfinding actually get stuck in the past. So, but yeah. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you.
That's another big challenge, is pathfinding within our game. But again, that's another roundtable.
Oh yeah.
Cool. I actually have to run. So I just want to take this moment to thank all you guys again. Love being a part of this. I just feel honored to be included, and I love hearing your guys' experience and thoughts on, things like what we talked about today, inspiration and story. I find it very inspiring and motivational just for me. And so I look forward to the next time we can do this. And if ever we set up a roundtable, we can show off some tools and things like that. That would be really exciting for me. So I'd definitely like to participate in that. And with that, I'll sign off. So Adam, Mark, and Matt. Matt, it was really nice meeting you. Have a good day, guys, and until next time.
All right.
Have a good day. Thanks,
Bye.
Stefan.
So who do we have left? I think.
And Stefan bolted out without picking his successor. So we're gonna have to do our own dice roll here.
I was about to comment on that. Yeah.
I know I haven't answered this question. Matt, have you answered this one?
No, I could just quickly go though. I was just thinking how much more appreciation I have now for games after doing, the development work. The stuff that you don't realize how complicated it's going to be. Adam, I think you were talking about just dropping some objects. I remember spending several days on that. It seems so simple. You just take an object in your inventory, you drop it. There it is. Oh my God, did that take a long time? Because all the things I hadn't considered, like, well, if you leave and come back, did the game save? Yes, it makes so much sense now. Whereas in the past, the game would it's gone. And you drop it, it's gone forever. That way we don't have to worry about saving it. But yeah, the dialogue is probably the most challenging thing for me too. I wanted something similar to the Telltale games, like the Walking Dead games, where you have some dialogue options, and then it'll say, well, Rick will remember that. Or you have, angered Rick or something. But when I got around to implementing that, I quickly realized this is going to be a very daunting. This is so much more complicated. I've heard that you could use Twine somehow to model some of this and incorporate it into Unity. So I'm still looking into that option. But yeah, that was again, and now I totally understand why you have so many characters in these games where they just have the same line of dialogue over and over, regardless. It's so much easier to do it that way. Now I get it.
That would be somewhat of the cautionary tale for the retro developers like me and Mark, which is do not let the cheapness, like you're going like, oh, it's going to be so hard to implement. I'll just do it this way. It's easier for me. Don't fall into that trap. Like, because I had that during my beta testing. The players are like, well, the damage numbers are coming up down below, but my eyes are on the action on the screen. I don't even see how much damage I'm doing. Can't you like make little numbers float up above their heads? And I'm like, that's so much work to do. I don't want to do that. But they kept on egging on me about it. So I finally did it. And you know what? They're right. That was the right decision.
So my dialogue, I wanted to have it so when you hovered over the dialogue options, they would light up blue, to help you make sure you were lining up on the right one. I think I spent like 2 weeks trying to figure out how to do that. And when I finally got it figured out, I made the mistake of upgrading my Unity engine when everything worked except for that. It totally broke my dialogue. So I'm like, you know what? I spent so long on that. To heck with it. I'm going to roll back to the previous one. But just in general, though, along this question, I've been thinking a lot about what Surtech did with the Wizardry series versus what Lord British or Garrett was doing with the Ultima, and that there's some strength. I guess there's a lot of advantages in using the same engine because its limitations. You are able to work within those constraints. And I remember talking to George Zeitz. We were talking about the Neverwinter Nights original campaign, which nobody really liked, versus some of the modules that were still like Mask of the Betrayer, for example, when he worked on, considered some of the best writing. And that was his argument, was that there's a lot of advantages in, I guess, those limitations, knowing the constraints you're working with. You can be very innovative. Versus if you're the developer, you're still working on the engine, then there is that tendency to say, well, I kind of got this idea. I'll go ahead and implement that. Then the feature, I guess you'd call it feature creep, right? Or the scope, you keep adding all these things. And the story about all that work for one little piece, in one dungeon, that's the only time you'll see it in the game. Wow. I can so relate to that. I remember Garrett's telling me a similar story about some portal, and he had this idea where you'd have these crystals, and you put the crystals in each of the alcoves of the portal and make the door open. Then he decided not to do that because it would require all those custom graphics and custom code, and it was going to only be in that one spot. so yeah, not a new problem.
Definitely not. So, are you done?
Oh yeah.
All right. I think Mark, you're the last.
All right. Yeah. So since I took the approach of build the engine and then tell the best story I could from the engine, I would say the technical limitations didn't really cause too much changing of the story because I was just tailoring the story to the technical limitations that were there. Now, as far as writing implementing something specifically to achieve a particular story milestone, absolutely. I did that on a number of occasions. And one of them I thought of, which I thought was particularly interesting and really kind of goes a bit, technically deep a bit, has to do with the Dark Void in Noxer Chaos that appears initially in the game as it's like the edges of the map, the 256 by 256 tile map. is just a region of the world of Valley that you're in. So there was no relevant concept of like the map wrapping when you go off the edge of it. I had to figure out some way to basically block the player because the game was not going to have these other regions of the world in it. And Dragonsmere actually is the name of one of the other regions. So it's kind of like each game I'm going to put in a different region, kind of like Skyrim did. And so conveniently, I had this dark void that fits into the storyline that was the boundaries of the map that would prevent the player from going off of it. And it wasn't arbitrary, just like, oh, you can't sail any further in this direction. There's a story tie-in with what's going on with this dark void. And something I decided to do kind of late in stage in things, because I just wasn't sure was it going to be technically possible with the memory disk that I had, et cetera, was to make it so that in like Act 3 of the game, have it so that the dark void expanded on the map, and instead of just being on the edges of the map, it kind of went, and shrunk the actual traversable map space considerably, and it was like a sign of the evil that was threatening in the land was like getting more powerful and encroaching further. So I just loved how it all tied in from a story standpoint, and I thought and it's going to be really cool from an implementation standpoint, because again, it's a case of where the world is reacting to events that have taken place to the point that the world itself is changing significantly in some way, which just would not have been typical for the tile-based RPG back in the day. So I really wanted to do it, and but it was a heavy lift technically, and what it really boils down to is essentially based on some trigger, I had to swap out the overworld map file or map data with a different one. Because this was not just changing a couple tiles that I could like patch in or something. It was like, no, the cleanest way is just have a completely different copy of the overworld map and copy it over the old one, etc. And so, well, the first consideration was, well, is there enough disk space to hold a copy, a second copy of the map? If no, game over, development game over. Well, it turns out there was. So I'm like, okay, maybe we're in business here. So I set all that up, and second copy of the map, and identify what the state trigger is going to be for that to happen. If I recall, it's after that high cult battle that I mentioned before, and got that working where the overworld map gets replaced, and everything seems great. And some beta tester tells me that, oh yeah, they won the game, and then they went to start a new game. And when they started the new game, the world that they start in has the expanded dark void, and which actually encompassed the game start. So when they leave the shipwreck to start the game, they're actually in the middle of this dark void. And it's like, oops, okay, something went wrong there. What's going on? Well, the deal is essentially there's a save game file, and the save game file has to have everything in it that has anything to do with the game state. So the 256 bytes of state flags, well, that's in the save game file. The player's inventory, well, that's in the save game file. Anything and everything that relates to the state of the game, it's gotta be there. And effectively there has to be working copies of that data for the game to modify as you go, because if you don't save the game, the player expects that they're going to start at the point of the last save. So for like inventory, for example, there is a inventory working file that the changes are made to as the player goes, and when the player hits the save game key, that working file for inventory and other things gets copied into the save game file. So in other words, anything that is state relevant that is going to be part of the save game data, it's basically whatever data you need, it's double that. to mirror it in the save game file and in the working files for the game. And well, the problem was we're not, you know, we're not talking about some state flags or even the inventory file. We're talking about the overworld map with 256 by 256 tiles. That is an enormous chunk of data. And there was no way that there was enough disk space to mirror that in the save game file and actually keep a copy of the entirety of the overworld map in the save game file. Out of the question. And I hadn't even considered it when I did the implementation on this. I was like, okay, well, I've got this copy of the expanded Dark Void overworld map on some disk somewhere, and when the trigger happens, I'm just going to copy it and overwrite the original, and done, right? Except, oops, well, when you after you win the game, or even not even after you win the game, but if you get past the point where the Dark Void expands and this copy happens, if for whatever reason, whether you've won the game or not, you go back to create the new game, well, okay, great, fine, except the overworld map copy that the game is going to be working from is going to have the Dark Void, because the Dark Void was copied on top of the original. The original is gone. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Only the Dark Void version was held in reserve for the moment where it was going to get copied on top of the original. So that was the conundrum, and it not being an option to they basically buffer the overworld map through the save game file. I basically had to come up with some kind of a solution to that, where when you start a new game, it was going to figure out that this trigger had happened and copy a copy of the original, the starting overworld map from a different disk, and then copy that into where the overworld map normally resides to essentially restore it. And as I'm saying this, I realize, okay, well, yes, there was disk space available somewhere to have a duplicate copy of the original overworld map. But the issue is Noxurcast has 4 5.5-inch discs, double-sided, so 8 disc sides that we're dealing with. Only one of them has the save game file. That particular disk did not have enough space to include the overworld map in the save game file. So that was not possible. But what I did is I stuck a copy of the original overworld map, a backup copy of that. I stuffed it off on like the boot disk or something, so that, you know, which did not alleviate the bottleneck at all as far as the save game file, but it made it so that when you're creating a new game, if there, you know, a certain state flag is flipped, or maybe I checked the first byte of the overworld map, I did something to detect it, that had been overwritten, and then the code in like the game loader would then reach out to the boot disk or wherever I stashed the backup of the starting overworld map and copy it in place for the fresh game. And I remember this being like a real, you know, white knuckle moment, because not only was it like, okay, where am I going to find the disk space to stash this backup copy? Does it exist? I had no idea, because I had not thought this through. It was not only that, but it was also in the game loader. Is there going to be enough memory to be able to add that without the game loader basically exceeding the amount of memory that it was supposed to be loading into and just creating a further cascade of problems? And fortunately, I was able to find solutions to all of those different things. And in the end, that particular feature got to stay. But it was almost a situation where, yes, I wrote this awesome, back to to the point of the original question, it was almost like I wrote this awesome specific thing for a storyline milestone. And then in beta testing, when it was revealed that there were these issues with it that I hadn't thought through, it was this close to like I actually had to rip out the entire thing, because there just wasn't enough memory and disk to do. But managed just barely to find the resources to solve the problem and shoehorn it in, and it remained in the final release of the game.
Wow.
So
Yeah, that
the
I had a,
story go ahead, Adam.
I had a similar issue. Like Realms of Antiquity, I avoided that problem because I knew that the maps would not be alterable. But then that fact that the maps shouldn't be altered meant I had originally had like magic barrier tiles, and they were part of the world, each of the maps. And so if you cast the dispel, it would like it had a clever logic of the maps had this is the tile to replace it with on this map if it gets replaced. That was all clever. And then guys were like, well, I was here and I cast a spell and then I reloaded the game and the barriers are back and I'm trapped. And I'm like, oh.
Essentially, you recognize the limitation, plan for it, but then later on decided, oh, hey, there's this way that I can cheat.
Right? So I ended up having to convert all the barriers into mob objects because mob objects are where
of course those are going to be in the save game file, right?
Yeah. They're actually each of I have the world divided by disc into 4 quarters. And so there was another thing where one chunk, the cursed woods connects up to a map in the second disc, but I can't do across mob things because I can't assume that the player has both discs in the drive at the same time. Like I can't alter mobs in another block. So I had to use a state flag to track that and have it that like, oh, if they've actually completed the global quest of restoring the woods, then when they get to the second map and they come up to like this barrier, it gets knocked down, and and now they can freely enter that area again. So there's a lot of little tricks like that to get around that exact problem that I didn't want to have to save map state at all, because it just would take too much memory and too much disk space to have copies of everything. I mean, that sounds intriguing, though. I mean, I would almost been like, couldn't you have worked it out? Use like a bit flag or something in the tile set to indicate this tile when the dark void is approaching, that this tile will be dark, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, the implications of that are I would have had to have essentially a stencil of the entire map with those flags, because Noxercast has over 1,000 unique tiles, and they're divided into tile sets of 256 tiles each, times like 5 or 6 sets or something. And it's and so the overworld has a tile set, towns have a tile set, castles have a tile set. That's how it's broken out. But the bottom line is, I've got a tile ID that it's an 8-bit tile ID. There's no spare bits on the tile ID for attribute flags for that sort of thing. And so with the tile ID using the full 8 bits, the only place that I could think of to store that kind of information would be on essentially a stencil that's mirroring the entire map, which of course in itself is going to cost a bunch of memory then. And which I didn't.
No, I see what you mean. Although what I did with elevation in Realms of Antiquity is I just stored the elevation numbers in its own file, separate, and then they're loaded separately, because not every map has elevation, so I don't need it. But the maps that do it elevation, they load it in its run length encoded data so that it just comes in. And in this case, if you had like a single bit value for your map, it could have been like just a 16K file that stores the on-off state for the dark zone, and it only gets accessed in after your part 3 to see, hey, is this tile supposed to be in the dark void?
So kind of like, okay, load the data from that file, parse it, and then modify the map data.
Modify the map in the engine as you go along.
Yeah.
So it's like hindsight, but
Yeah, I hear you. That's definitely a way to do it. Whether or not it would have worked out any better in my case, I'm not sure. In part because obviously you're talking about a chunk of memory tied up somewhere for the parsing. Now maybe that could run through a swap buffer where the parsing code gets loaded into the swap buffer, and then runs the code to read the 16K file. Maybe that could work out without requiring more memory. But the real kicker is that I think might have burned me in the end on that is the overworld map is stored. It's broken down into zones that are 16 by 16 each, tiles each.
Yeah.
And each zone is its own block of compression, ZX7 compression. And so what ends up happening is only like 9 zones are in memory at any one time. And like when you move a certain distance north, south, east, or west, it'll eventually trigger a zone transition where it loads in 3 more zones to replace what basically fell off the edge of the regional map. And then those are going to get uncompressed into memory. So as I'm saying this out loud, I think it would be in that routine that does the zone transition as it's pulling in the compressed data. It's going to uncompress it, and then it would have to run through the parser that we're talking about to then identify the tile.
Yeah.
I think it could work, but it would be computationally probably on the complex side because it would have to line it up between this specific zone of data against the control file to then determine should it be flipping those tiles to dark or not.
Yeah. Although another thought, if each zone had its dark void data tagged at the end in bit length bits, 0 1s. Although I don't know if ZX7 would like compressing that kind of data, but
that I could see that would maybe be another way to do it. And in the end, there's multiple ways to do anything. Mm-hmm. It's really hard, especially with these complex topics. It's really hard to tell sometimes, like, okay, we got path A, B, and C. Which one is going to be the best path for memory? Which one's going to be the best for disk? Which one's going to be the best, for CPU or otherwise the response time? And it's trade-offs between them. And I can remember, and I can't tell at this point between the 2 solutions we're discussing. And that was the case in a lot of situations. I remember where it was like I just had to guess and pick one sometimes, or maybe I ways down the road and it would start to become more obvious. Nope, this one is going to be more memory intensive, and I would be better to go the disk intensive route. Such are the challenges that we get to deal with on the 8-bit hardware.
That is absolutely true. And we kind of got off in the weeds on that one, but I think that's kind of what we're aiming for. So,
well, yeah, that hopefully
it was real interesting to me as someone who doesn't have those limitations. Like, this was a understandable and followable example of exactly where you run into limitations that I don't have.
Yeah, we just run smack right into them. And sometimes there's solutions that can be found, but you have to really noodle it, and then, so
and performance is a big part of it. I mean, my TI is like a 3 megahertz processor, but it's got an 8-bit infrastructure, so it's really not that much faster than a 6502. So I have I have weird performance restrictions around the video because I don't actually have memory mapped video, which means that on the Apple you can just write to somewhere in memory and it'll appear on screen. With the TI, you have to write to a single 8-bit port to push data to the video or read it out of it. So that creates weird limitations and restrictions. Sure. So are you done?
Yeah, that was my answer to the last question. Very good question.
Yeah. No, I think we're kind of wrapping up the roundtable here. So thank you, Matt Barton, for being our guest star.
Yep. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, guys. It's been an honor.
Yeah. And as we said, we got some ideas for maybe a future roundtable. Sounds like transaction and dialogue systems are of great interest to everyone, both modern and retro. So that might be a good time to maybe show off some of the tools and pieces that we use to build these games.
Yeah, that all sounds great to me. So,
Yeah.
for everyone watching, thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next episode whenever we do this. And as you've heard, we've got some exciting topics that we're looking forward to chatting about, and hope you can join us for that as well.
All right.
Bye bye. Bob's your uncle.
Yeah, that's also part of it. A big part of it for me is, and there's just a lot of unknowns because Unity hasn't come clear on everything. They've actually said they don't know exactly how they're going to track installs, but like they have said that they're only going to track first time installs, and the only real way they can do that is through digital platforms like Steam or consoles. But if you want to sell a game DRM free or sell it on your website, there's no way that they're going to be able to track that effectively. And then the other thing they said is that they're not going to be able to track every install individually 100% of the time. And they've said, but don't worry, it's going to be conservative. We're more likely to undertrack and or underreport installs. And I'm like, if you can't with 100% certainty, if you can't take this install that I have to pay for and show me who installed it with certainty, then why would I pay? You know, like why would anybody pay?
Yeah.
So it's a big mess, and there's already class action lawsuits being put together, and
As there should be. I mean,
it's
I think who's it, Leonard Brassard. I follow him on Twitter. He's been posting some pretty good insights because he knows guys inside Unity, and he basically said the Unity employees have been telling them for a month, like, this is a really bad idea. This is really confusing post message you're intending to send, and nobody in corporate listened. So
they thought that we'll announce this, people will be a bit upset about it, but you know what'll happen is our stocks will go up because it's going to show we're going to make a lot more money. And that never happened. Heard that like 2 days after the announcement, the CEO dumped 2,000 shares.
Yeah, I heard about that too. Although that's a drop in the bucket in stock, and it might have been pre-done, but hopefully the SEC is looking into that.
That's true.
The other thing he said was that actually Unity, the reason they're in this state is that they're in a really bad financial state even before the announcement. So yeah, somebody got greedy. So
they were losing money, and they're not innovating. Anybody who like was innovating in that company is not there anymore, and the new CEO who came from EA is just known for not having a mind about anything to do with video games. There's lots of ways I think Unity could monetize that's effective in partnership with, for instance, indies, but they just don't have the right leadership there to make those kind of decisions.
There's a lot of corporate guys who are not. They better wake the fuck up to the fact that content creators, be they writers, actors, or video game designers, you can easily kill the golden goose if you mismanage things.
Yeah,
like WotC basically completely backed out, and then they shoved all of their stuff into Creative Commons, so as to try and get back goodwill.
Which was literally like the one thing they could possibly do to get back any goodwill, because that was the one thing that they could do that was, we can't possibly try this trick again.
Yeah,
we have made it impossible to betray your trust in this specific matter again, ever. And that was like the only thing they could possibly have done to get any goodwill back.
Yeah, and trust me, there are guys that will just hate them forever. So
yeah, I was just looking at the stock. So at one point, Unity was almost $200 a share back in November of 2021, and now it's $36. So
that's crazy.
So
yeah, actually, you know what?
A lot of money. I hope that they sold it closer to the 200 than 30.
One of our developers, it came from Unity, and he joined us about a year ago, I guess, and super talented guy. The only reason we got him is because some of our team members are friends with him. So he left Unity and came and worked with us. He's working with us currently, but he has shares, and he's had shares for a while now. And he keeps looking at the stock and like, oh, because he wants to wait for it to go back up again
Oh,
before he
sure.
sells them. But
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
I know it's not looking good.
Now, when I worked at Microsoft, anytime I got stock awards, which is, I hate that system of bonuses. It's just give me a freaking cash bonus. Don't do stocks. But one of my bosses just said you should just sell your stocks immediately, because they always make sure that when you get awarded is when it's at its lowest point, and you'll never really have an opportunity to sell. I kind of wish I hadn't listened to him, because Microsoft stock jumped up after I left.
Even when it's at its lowest point, it's still pretty good with Microsoft there.
Yeah.
That time period, yeah.
I just remember this Unity stock. Every time it seemed like it was starting to go up, there would be this huge insider dump where they'd sell all their shares off, and then it would be the scuttlebutt would be, oh, there must be something horrible happening. Why are all the insiders selling so many shares? Down it goes.
All right.
Then you can stop recording.
Trying to find the button.